The story opens on a young boy standing in the middle of a battlefield, surrounded by soldiers who didn't make it out alive. While other kids were already walking through the academy gates, this boy, Almark, wouldn't get there until 2 years later than everyone else. That's because he was busy just trying to stay alive, covered in blood out on the brutal battlefields of the north. He grew up in that kind of world, finishing off enemies on snow that turned red beneath him. That path was set for him the day he was born, as the son of a mercenary working the northern territories. Down south, peace had held for 100 years. Up north, the fighting never stopped and nobody was winning. Nations kept rising and falling, and countless lives were thrown away in the process, so mercenaries flocked to the north to cash in on the chaos. After the fighting died down, Almark's father Reyes, along with Captain Gels, came to get him and told him it was time to head home. Reyes was vice-captain of the Black Wolf Cavalry, a unit known for being sharp, well-equipped, and dangerous. Almark first crossed paths with a man named Jorg when he was just 5, back when the mercenaries were bouncing from one job to the next. At the time, the Black Wolf Cavalry was cutting through the buffer zone between the Phalan Kingdom and Gilbar. When one of the men commented on how quiet things seemed, the commander snapped at him for letting his guard down during a scouting run. The man apologized right away, and that's when they heard shouting and the sound of someone being chased. An old man with a long beard came running in a panic, screaming for help and insisting he had no gold to hand over. A pack of bandits laughed at how rich he looked, while the commander counted about 30 of them, way more than one man could handle alone. Word came in that the Gilbar army was up ahead, so the commander decided to clear the bandits out fast and get his unit moving again. The bandits finally cornered the old man, mocking how fast he'd run and threatening to kill him, careful not to get blood on his fancy clothes. Their taunting got cut off when the commander came charging in on horseback and took one of them down in a single strike. The rest of the bandits panicked, completely thrown off by why a bunch of professional mercenaries had shown up in the middle of nowhere. Once the fighting was over, the commander caught his breath and asked his men if any of the bandits had gotten away. The commander warned the old man that this whole area was about to turn into a battlefield, so traveling alone was a bad idea. The old man just kept thanking him over and over for the rescue. Turning back to his unit, the commander told them to quit picking through the bodies and get moving, right as they realized one of their own, a man named Wanner, had been killed in the fight. Thinking about their position, the commander decided to keep pushing forward, since spotting the Gilba army first would give them a real edge. After giving his men the signal to move out, the commander turned back to the traveler to leave him with one last piece of advice. He told the old man that if he was going to travel alone, he should wait for the main unit to come through and just mention the name Reyes to get a spot on one of their carriages. He reassured the surprised old man that the main unit traveled with women and children too, so it'd be safe to ride with them all the way to the border. Before the old man could even respond, the commander and his scouts took off, leaving him standing alone on the road, watching them disappear. Back at the Black Wolf Cavalry camp, the vice-captain was greeted by his men, but he had to admit their scouting run hadn't turned up any sign of the Gilba army. While he was reaffirming their mission to protect the Phalan army's supply lines, a woman came up and told him she'd brought back the person he mentioned earlier. She explained she'd found the strange old man who claimed to know him, and it clicked. This was the same guy from earlier, now waiting over by the carriages. After thanking her for the update, he headed toward the center of camp, where dinner was already cooking over an open fire. He found the old man sitting alone and brought him a bowl of warm soup, then sat down beside him now that things had calmed down. As he started eating, the old traveler introduced himself properly as Jorg and thanked him again, sincerely, for the rescue. Jorg insisted he had to find some way to repay Reyes for saving his life, especially given his rank as vice-captain. Reyes laughed off the idea of a reward, joking about what an old man could possibly offer him, but his curiosity kicked in the moment Jorg revealed he was headmaster of the Nork Magic Academy down south. Reyes figured it was a bad joke at first, but Jorg calmly explained he was actually traveling to find kids with real magical talent. Jorg mentioned he'd lost his staff on the road, then picked up a plain stone to show just how much he could still do without one. Right in front of Reyes, the stone turned into a living bird and flew off, leaving a trail of glowing feathers behind, and Reyes completely stunned. Now a believer, Reyes admitted he'd actually heard of the Nork Magic Academy, known for giving anyone with real talent a shot, no matter where they came from. Reyes stared at the headmaster in awe, remembering that graduates from a school like that were basically guaranteed a successful future. Jorg laid out the academy's rules rules, explaining kids could only enroll at age 9 for a 6-year program split into elementary and middle levels, all based on Nork Island in the Galai Kingdom. He added that after 6 years, graduates became full magicians, though those who wanted to specialize could stick around for 3 more years in the advanced division. As night fell over the campfire, Reyes went quiet and troubled while Jorg sat there watching a bird. Reyes asked him to confirm that the academy really was only for the talented, then steered the conversation toward his own son. He introduced his son as Allmark, almost 5 years old, and mentioned the boy's mother had died shortly after giving birth to him. He talked about how hard it was being a mercenary where trust was a luxury nobody could really afford, and admitted he worried Allmark was too timid without the drive needed for that life. With grim certainty, Reyes predicted his son wouldn't make it past 15 if he ended up stuck in the mercenary trade. Even knowing the boy had no talent for magic, Reyes just hoped Allmark could find some kind of peaceful life down south far from any battlefield. Desperate for a different future for his son, Reyes bowed low and begged Jorg to let the boy into the academy. Jorg found the whole thing strange, stroking his beard as he looked down at the man still bowing in front of him. He pointed out the irony that the man who'd saved his life was now the one on his knees, begging for help. Addressing him as Reyes Dono, Jorg agreed to think it over but said he'd need to meet the boy first. The scene shifted to the busy camp, where workers were cooking dinner and handling the evening chores. Reyes pointed out his son sitting alone by the bonfire and called out his name to get his attention. Allmark happily ran up to greet his father, but froze the second the old man introduced himself. The boy ducked behind his father's armor in fear, and Reyes apologized for his son's shyness while telling him not to be pathetic about it. Jorg complimented the boy's caution, saying it showed a sharp mind, while Reyes kept trying to coax him out. Reassuring Allmark that everything was fine, Jorg reached his hand out toward the nervous kid. Reyes urged his son to step forward, watching closely as Allmark trembled with obvious fear. The moment Jorg's fingers touched the boy's forehead, a spark shot out, and it left the old man completely stunned. Jorg admitted, still in shock, that he'd met plenty of talented kids before, but never one with potential like this. Reyes beamed with pride at the compliment, while Jorg predicted the boy would make a fine mercenary too, since his sword skills were already coming in early. Placing a hand on Allmark's head, Jorg brushed off the idea that swordsmanship was really what mattered most for his future. He explained that surviving out on real missions took mental toughness above anything else, with physical strength coming in second. Jorg understood where Reyes was coming from and told him to bring the boy to the academy once he turned 9. Confident the kid would grow into a great magician, Jorg promised to send directions, and Reyes agreed, pulling Allmark into a proud hug. Near the border, the old traveler thanked Reyes again, sincerely, for everything he'd done during their journey. Jorg said he was looking forward to seeing Allmark again in 4 years, and Reyes insisted it was really him who owed the thanks. Before the two said their goodbyes, years passed at the camp, and eventually a hand reached out for the hilt of a heavy blade. Even though Reyes never once tried to teach him, Allmark practiced hard with his father's old sword, turning into a skilled fighter just like Jorg had predicted. As he grew older, Allmark stayed quiet and shy, but his eyes started carrying a sharp, clear kind of awareness as he watched everything happening around camp. When Allmark was 8, the men marched off, leaving the women behind to face the Moraceful cavalry knights in battle. While the men were gone, disaster struck. A soldier got trampled and screamed for everyone to run. 2 enemy soldiers raided the base, proving just how dangerous they were by killing 5 people almost instantly. The attackers mocked the defenseless camp, saying the Black Wolf cavalry was nothing without its main force. One soldier cornered a woman, telling her nobody was coming to save her, not realizing Allmark was already lunging at him from behind, sword raised. Caught completely off guard, the enemy didn't stand a chance as Allmark swung his blade and cut the man's hand clean off. The wounded soldier gasped in horror at how precise the boy's strike had been, blood spraying across the ground. The battle against the knights ended in a draw, and when Reyes got back with an injured hand, he listened as the women told him what had happened during the attack. Gels suggested it might be time to send the boy out to the battlefield, but Reyes hesitated, pointing out that 12 was the usual age for that, and 8 was still too young for Allmark. Inside a tent, a commander in black armor was asking whether someone capable of fighting should already be sent to the battlefield, right as a shadow appeared at the entrance. A young boy walked in to welcome his father home, while a woman asked whether anyone had gotten hurt on the recent mission. The long-haired commander praised Allmark for taking down the attackers who'd targeted the camp, and Reyes confirmed it really was his son who'd done it. it. The commander then suggested Allmark try his hand on the battlefield once spring came around, catching the boy completely off guard. After a moment of silence, Allmark simply agreed to the idea. With that settled, winter passed, and Allmark turned 9 right as the new season rolled in. Because the mercenary situation had gotten worse, Reyes couldn't leave the group, so instead of attending an entrance ceremony at the academy, Allmark made his debut on the battlefield. He found himself in a losing fight during his second battle, spending his days bleeding on the field instead of studying in a classroom. By the time summer rolled around, Allmark had already been through 5 major battles, getting a firmer grip on his sword with each one. The boy was now considered a full warrior in his own right, standing ready to follow whatever order came next from his father. Reyes told his son to change his clothes and meet him in the tent right away. Despite everything going on, Reyes never gave up on getting his son into the Magic Academy, using every break between battles to teach him himself. Allmark picked up everything from reading and writing to math and morals just as fast as he'd picked up his sword skills. Even while the boy kept practicing his swordsmanship, Reyes hid his growing unease as Allmark's 9th summer came to a close. Things stayed relatively quiet for Reyes until one day everything changed. Allmark nearly died after getting stabbed through the chest by a spearman named Angal, and he spent over a month in bed while his father stayed by his side. Once Allmark woke up, his father told him he'd be leaving camp the next day and shut down his wish to keep fighting, calling it foolish. Reyes raised his voice, saying Allmark would only be a liability on the front lines, leaving the boy completely stunned. Even after Allmark swore he'd get stronger, his father coldly told him it was already too late for that. Reyes explained they were heading to the kingdom of Bastia, where the fighting would be even worse, and told Allmark straight out that he wouldn't survive there in his current condition. A scarred man told the boy that being a mercenary was a losing game and pushed him to aim for something bigger. He warned that most stories about common soldiers becoming knights were made up, explaining that people usually just get used and tossed aside once they're not useful anymore. Looking over a desk piled with books, the man told Allmark that a sword alone wasn't enough, that he needed to learn how to think for himself instead of just leaning on his father. He stressed that real greatness comes from actions that move people, not just from studying. The boy gripped his own leg tightly and took the advice in, calling the man his father. Reyes felt a wave of relief that his son understood and thanked him as they wrapped up the conversation. After being told to say his goodbyes, Allmark stepped out of the tent and found Garba and Mary waiting for him. Garba promised he'd be a warrior himself by the time they met again, while Mary, in tears, begged Allmark not to forget them, and he promised he wouldn't. 2 more members of the Black Wolf Cavalry said their goodbyes, telling him to be proud of where he came from and to stay healthy and careful. Veterans of the unit, Gels, Morgard, Gador, and Jizak, all wished him a safe journey, and Allmark thanked them for everything. Allmark made one last stop to see Derek, who was surprised to see him before he headed out. Derek gave him one last vote of confidence, telling him that as Reyes' son, he'd be just fine wherever he ended up. The boy reflected on all his good memories with the group, the shared meals, the warmth of belonging to that mercenary band. Standing on the hill, Reyes asked if his son had everything he needed and proudly called him a full-fledged warrior. Then, despite all his confidence, he pulled out a necklace, a keepsake from Allmark's mother, Shetina. He explained the stone would protect Allmark no matter what happened, and the boy took it, asking his father to take care of himself too. Allmark started down the path, waving back at his father, who watched him go with a smile. As he got farther away, Allmark clutched the necklace and whispered one last goodbye to his father. It was the moment that truly split parent and child, each of them now heading down their own path. His journey eventually brought him to a busy harbor town, where he confirmed he'd finally reached Nork Island. To reach the Nork Magic Academy way down south, Allmark had to cross the dangerous northern lands and the entire central continent. It was a brutal trip for a 9-year-old, fighting through the start of winter, hunger, monsters, and people with bad intentions. Surrounded by enemies up north, he narrowly escaped death more than once thanks to his sword skills, occasionally catching a break among traveling warriors and magicians. All that hardship left him with a heavy heart, realizing that most people he'd trusted eventually betrayed him, forcing him to learn how to tell who he could actually rely on. After somehow surviving the brutal northern winter, he crossed the Menoba Strait and made it to the Central Plains just as spring arrived. The calm, prosperous feel of the plains was a whole new world for Allmark, who'd grown up surrounded by non-stop war up north. While buying food at a stall, he mentioned he'd come from the north, and the vendor was surprised to hear it. She was so impressed that he'd made it that far alone that she gave him extra extra food, leaving him grateful and a little stunned. Resting at an inn, Allmark thought about how kind everyone had been, and for the first time, admitted to himself that this journey had actually become enjoyable. By the time he reached the Continental Trade District at age 10, he was out of money and had to keep going looking like a beggar. Sleeping outside every night, he realized the winters down south weren't all that different from the freezing cold he'd known up north. Staring up at the stars during those lonely nights, he started mastering the art of talking himself through it just to stay focused. Another spring came and Allmark ended up working the docks, with a foreman ordering him around to carry more supplies. With Nork Island finally visible across the water, he spent a whole month working the port just to earn enough for the boat fare. Allmark finally set foot on Nork Island, feeling a wave of relief that his long journey was finally over. He stopped a woman to ask for directions to the academy and was stunned when she told him the school took up more than a third of the entire island. After she told him to follow the main road, he made his way through town while she waved him off. He started running toward a huge tower in the distance, wondering if that massive structure was actually part of the academy he was looking for. Approaching a set of giant iron bars, Allmark looked for a main entrance and started to suspect something almost unbelievable. Standing there, dwarfed by that colossal iron structure, it hit him that wall itself was the academy's main gate. Allmark called out at the gate until a guard with a spear came over asking his business. He introduced himself as Allmark from the north and said he needed to see the headmaster. The guard brushed him off, saying the headmaster was away and no one had told him about any visitor. He figured the kid was just another troublemaker and told him to leave. Allmark stood his ground, insisting he wasn't going back since he'd been personally invited by Headmaster Jorg to become a student there. The guard was caught off guard that the boy knew the headmaster's name and took a second look at just how worn out and travel-beaten he looked. After a moment's hesitation, the guard sighed and agreed to walk him over to the headmaster's office. He told the boy to follow him, and the two started walking together toward the main academy buildings. Along the way, the guard explained they were at the main building of Nork Magic Academy, where students spent 3 years on their elementary studies. Allmark was blown away by the size of the place, and the guard said it'd be a good thing if the kid actually managed to graduate. He added that the main building also served as the elementary dorm and housed the principal's office. The two kept walking through the grand, quiet halls of the academy. They eventually reached a set of ornate doors, which the guard said led to the principal's office. Before going in, the guard stopped and held out his hand toward the boy. He explained he needed to hold onto the boy's sword for the meeting, and Allmark handed it over without protest. The guard was shocked by how heavy the weapon was and struggled just to hold it upright, while Allmark watched in silence. The guard knocked to announce a child wanted to come in, and they were told to enter. They stepped into a room stacked with books, and the guard formally introduced the boy to the man sitting inside. Behind a large desk sat an old man with a long beard, and Allmark instantly recognized him as Headmaster Jorg. The guard reported that the boy had been waiting at the main gate, while Jorg introduced himself and asked the kid to state his name. The guard apologized for interrupting, explaining he'd brought the boy in because he already knew the headmaster's name right as Allmark stepped forward to introduce himself. Jorg turned the name over in his head for a second, then realized this was the son of Vice Captain Reyes from the Black Wolf Cavalry. The guard flinched as Jorg suddenly slammed his hands on the desk, blurting out the names Reyes and the Black Wolf. Jorg asked if he was really Allmark, Reyes' son, and the boy confirmed it, bringing up how his father had once been helped by Jorg himself. After sending the guard away, Jorg asked Allmark to step closer so he could get a better look at his face. Jorg was stunned, realizing that if this really was Reyes' son from the Black Wolf Cavalry, then there was no doubt left. Bursting with curiosity, he started firing off questions: why Allmark was 2 years late and why he'd shown up alone looking like that. Allmark gave a small smile and reminded him gently that he couldn't answer that many questions all at once. Jorg apologized for getting carried away and asked if he could ask just one more serious question. He asked how things stood with the war and the cavalry, and Allmark told him honestly it had actually gotten much worse. Jorg let out a heavy sigh about the coming fight against the Abyss King, and it left Allmark curious about who exactly that was. Waving off his own rambling, Jorg said how impressively the boy had grown, and Allmark thanked him politely. Allmark asked if he could ask a question of his own about a group called the Gilfin Magic Defense Corps. He confirmed he knew of the group, and Jorg described them as something unique among the northern forces. Jorg explained that plenty of southern magicians had gone north to test themselves, but most of them died from the harsh climate climate and endless fighting. He noted that a few had actually made it, but the academy stayed wary of anyone from the north who only wanted magic to go back and fight. When Allmark asked what his point was, Jorg admitted this whole conversation was basically an entrance exam, since they rarely let northern students in anymore. He asked Allmark straight out what he planned to do with magic once he learned it, and whether he intended to go back north and use it like the others before him. Allmark admitted he would go back north, explaining that his trip through the peaceful south had made him question the unfairness of his own home. Clenching his fist, he declared he was determined to bring peace back to the north, believing a real leader has to live for his people. Moved by the boy's conviction, Jorg officially welcomed Allmark into the Nork Magic Academy. As Allmark left the room, he ran into the same guard from earlier, who gave him a sincere apology for the earlier tension. The guard laughed, saying he'd never seen the headmaster that flustered before. Introducing himself as Jeed, he explained the headmaster had asked him to look after the boy and bring him to the school building the next morning. Allmark introduced himself in return, and the two shook hands. Jeed handed the heavy sword back, admitting it was too much for him to carry, and Allmark took it back with a quick thanks. After wrapping up some paperwork at the desk, Jeed thanked the staff and led Allmark out of the office. Jeed pointed toward the dorms, but stopped to say there was something important they needed to take care of first. Looking Allmark over, Jeed remarked that the boy had clearly lost all sense of decency out on the road, joking that he smelled like rotting fish. Allmark took a minute to wash up at a well before heading back to Jeed, who apologized for making him wait. Jeed told him to change into his uniform once they got to the dorm, since there was no way he could attend class looking like that. Jeed brought up rumors about northerners being rough and barbaric, and Allmark quickly set the record straight. Allmark explained that only a handful of his people actually enjoyed killing, and Jeed just nodded and kept walking toward the dorm. Allmark was caught off guard when Jeed suddenly draped a high-quality cape over his shoulders. Jeed told him it suited him well and to keep it on, and Allmark noticed how it seemed to match Jeed's whole presence. Allmark asked if he'd once been a mercenary, saying he was picking up more of a noble vibe from him instead. As they made their way through the woods, Jeed checked in to see if Allmark needed a break before they reached their destination. Jeed marveled at the fact that Allmark had really walked the entire way from the northern continent on foot. They kept up the pace until Jeed finally announced they'd arrived. Allmark stood there in stunned silence at the massive building looming in front of them. Noticing his reaction, Jeed explained the dormitory had actually been modeled after a king's vacation home. Jeed mentioned 100 students lived across the mansion's 4 floors, though to Allmark it felt way too quiet and empty inside. Allmark asked if he'd be living there too, and Jeed confirmed all the elementary students stayed in that building, adding it was quiet right now since everyone was in class. Jeed suggested they start by greeting the superintendent, describing her as a good person, just a bit loud. They reached her office and Jeed knocked, mentioning she should have already gotten word about Allmark's enrollment. A voice from inside told them to stop wasting time knocking and just come in, since the door was always open anyway. Stepping into what looked like an empty room, Allmark wondered if the caretaker was using some kind of invisibility magic, figuring that'd be pretty typical for a magic academy. He nearly jumped when an old woman suddenly appeared right in front of him out of nowhere. Jeed introduced him as Allmark-kun to Maya-san, and the boy politely said hello. Maya skipped the small talk and went straight into the rules, telling Allmark he had to eat in the cafeteria twice a day and shouldn't cry about missing home. She warned him not to complain about the tiny room or the hard bed, reminding him he was just one of 100 students living there. Maya said his room was number 31, but Jeed cut in, saying he'd been told it was actually 341 and went looking for the right key. After finding the key for room 341, Jeed said goodbye to a silent Maya and led Allmark out to head upstairs. Jeed commented that Allmark's cape looked expensive, though the boy insisted he didn't come from money at all. Heading up to the 3rd floor, Allmark wondered how the superintendent would react if she knew what he had hidden under that cape. They reached room 341, and Jeed unlocked the door to show Allmark his new quarters. While most rooms were shared by 2 students, Jeed explained Allmark would be staying in this one alone for the rest of the year. Noticing he had no luggage, Jeed asked if the sword was really all he had, and Allmark thanked him for the cloak that had honestly saved his life on the road. Jeed suggested Allmark change out of his travel clothes to keep the bed clean, promising to bring his new uniform soon. Allmark agreed and started undressing, but Jeed suddenly froze, stunned by what he saw on the boy's back. Jeed noticed the muscle and a deep scar underneath, realizing just how brutal his journey must have been, before excusing himself to grab some food. As noise from returning students filled the hallway, Jeed noted it was almost dinner time and said he'd bring the uniform along with the meal. Jeed told him everyone ate together and headed off to the cafeteria, while Allmark watched the students gathering outside from his window. He hoped he'd make some friends, thinking about how strange it felt to finally be one of the students he used to watch from a distance down south. Looking out at the Nork Academy of Magic, he thought of his arrival as the start of a new life and the end of a long, painful journey. A memory of the cold northern wind came back to him, a figure running breathlessly through the wild. A group of armed men charged forward with a roar, the sounds of battle filling the air. The boy in the memory ran desperately through tall grass while something massive nearly crushed him from above. He found himself pinned down, his legs tangled in the vegetation, while a cold-eyed knight watched from a distance. From atop his horse, the knight gave the order to kill everyone, no mercy. Panicking, unable to break free, the boy screamed at his own body to move as a soldier closed in on him. He woke up suddenly, gasping for air and drenched in sweat after the nightmare. Realizing he was safe at the Nork Academy of Magic, Allmark tried to steady his breathing after the shock of the dream. Sitting up, he reached for his wrapped weapon, telling himself the dream was just a piece of something he'd actually lived through. He remembered being pinned down until his father's unit saved them from a man known as the Iron Knight of the Zale's Interceptor mercenaries. Recalling the magical grass that had trapped them, he thought about his father's deep hatred for using magic on the battlefield. His father had always told him to kill anyone carrying a staff without hesitation, and Allmark gripped his sword hilt tightly, back in the present. He checked the pendant he now kept hidden inside his scabbard for safety, instead of wearing it around his neck like he originally did when his father gave it to him. To him, that pendant was tied to his very life. He believed losing it would mean certain death. Holding both his father's long sword and his mother's pendant, he felt the full weight of the protection they'd given him his whole life. Alone in the quiet room, he sat on the edge of his bed and whispered a final word to his mother. Jeed walked in with breakfast, calling him Mr. Zeed and letting him know this would be his last meal alone before joining everyone else in the cafeteria starting that night. Allmark dug into his breakfast the second he was invited to, nodding how good the food smelled. After finishing and thanking him for the meal, he asked Zeed where he could wash up and fix his hair before his first day. Zeed pointed him toward some water nearby and handed over a school uniform, telling him to change quickly before he got back. On his way through the building, Allmark paused at the stairs to peek into the cafeteria, where the other students were already gathered. He briefly pictured himself fitting in with the group, then brushed the thought aside, doubting they'd accept him that easily. While he was washing up, someone told him everyone had been curious what kind of amazing person he'd turn out to be and that he looked pretty normal, which made him apologize for the letdown. Allmark introduced himself and learned the girl's name was Julia Cugin, then asked if she was okay, since she wasn't eating with the others. Julia said she was safe from getting scolded as long as she left before a woman named Maya showed up, then pointed out that Allmark looked like he hadn't been sleeping much. She told him to bring any more questions to someone else and walked off, leaving Allmark alone to realize his hair was still a mess. Back in the room, Zeed welcomed him and admired his sword, and Allmark explained it was a sturdy gift from his father that had survived the whole trip. Zeed noticed how tired he looked and asked if something had happened, so Allmark mentioned running into the girl downstairs. Once he heard Julia Cugin's name, Zeed chuckled at his bad luck, agreeing she was tough to deal with, especially since Allmark already felt like he wasn't living up to anyone's expectations. Zeed teased him a little more about his rotten luck and brought up another girl named Wendy, but their talk got cut off by the sound of bells ringing. Realizing they were running late, Zeed hurried him to throw on his uniform so they could get to the school building right away. Allmark quickly pulled on his black robes and followed Zeed as they rushed out to make it in time. As he moved, Allmark thought back to his life up north where magicians were despised, which made his father's decision to send him here to learn magic a huge shock at the time. He'd spent all that time training with a sword, hoping his father would change his mind, since he could never picture a life outside of being a mercenary. Despite everything, his father never budged, and the full explanation he gave on that last day at home was what finally convinced Allmark to leave the mercenary life behind. He realized his old drive to become a mercenary had really come from wanting to make his father proud, and from being scared of looking intimidated by magic itself. Walking forward now, Allmark carried the pride of being a brave mercenary's son, determined to prove his own courage to everyone around him. Zeed explained how northern magic magic was woven deep into people's everyday lives, a stark difference from how the South saw it. Calling out to Allmark, he signaled it was time to move, and the boy followed close behind. After getting a compliment on his new uniform, Allmark reaffirmed his determination to become a magician. Walking through the woods, Allmark admitted he was excited, since this was his first time ever attending an actual school. Picking up on his shift in mood, Zed stopped to ask if something was bothering him or if he was just lost in thought. Zed spoke plainly, warning Allmark that his father's mercenary background wasn't going to go over well in this region. He explained that, since there hadn't been a war here in a century, the locals looked down on fighters and treated them like savages. Apologizing for being so blunt, Zed added that this kind of prejudice toward mercenaries was pretty common among the locals. Allmark shot back that Southerners didn't understand the full picture and wrongly assumed Northerners killed each other for no reason. Thinking back on his travels, Allmark reflected on how people down south acted like war had nothing to do with them, like it was only something barbarians dealt with. Even though he hated war himself, he felt like the Southern mindset clashed with everything he'd been raised to believe. Standing his ground, Allmark declared that no matter the local bias, he was still proud to be the son of the mercenary Rees. Zed stayed quiet, thinking about a difficult task the headmaster had given him regarding the boy's enrollment. Hiding a father's real occupation was a lot to ask of an 11-year-old, especially inside a prestigious royal school like this one. He showed Allmark the official paperwork where his father's job had been changed to blacksmith to make sure he'd get accepted. Zed gave him one last warning that if the truth about his father's real job ever came out, life at the school would get extremely hard. Remembering his father's advice to think for himself, Allmark felt the weight of the secret while still holding onto his pride. He understood that on this journey he couldn't just follow his feelings, he had to keep his focus on the path ahead. Allmark agreed to stay quiet about his father's real job, letting Zed lead him the rest of the way. Reaching the school entrance, Zed asked if Allmark had been placed in the class of a teacher named Miss Fior. When they met, the woman introduced herself as Miss Fior and confirmed she'd be his teacher for the class he was transferring into. She thanked Zed for his hard work bringing the boy over, and he stepped back, ready to let her handle the rest of the introductions. After one last handshake and an offer to help at the gate if he ever needed it, Allmark followed Miss Fior toward the classroom on the 3rd floor. Along the way, she explained the elementary division was a 3-year program with small classes covering both general education and basic magic. She encouraged him, mentioning his rumored talent for magic, and reassured him he didn't need to rush his learning even, though the others already had some skill. Miss Fior mentioned happily that his arrival brought the class up to 16, which finally meant everyone could have a partner for paired activities. Reaching the door, she told him it was almost time for class and invited him to step inside his new classroom. Allmark walked in and took in the sight of his new classmates already settled at their desks. He noticed a mix of reactions as he passed by, some curious, some indifferent, a few even friendly. Miss Fior led him to the front of the room and called for everyone's attention to introduce the new transfer student. She officially presented him as the 16th member of the class and told everyone to welcome him and get along. As the teacher started the lesson, Allmark could feel the weight of every student's stare fixed right on him. Thinking back to his travels with street performers, he looked for his seat and noticed a girl in the front row watching him closely. While Allmark wondered about his classmates' backgrounds, Miss Fior prompted him to give a quick introduction to the room. Allmark said he was from the Kingdom of Arnetti, deciding to be upfront about his northern roots, while the teacher mentioned his late enrollment. A girl named Wendy raised her hand to point out an empty seat, and the teacher told Allmark to take the spot right next to her. After a quick, friendly hello from Wendy, the teacher signaled it was time to start the lesson and told everyone to open their textbooks. The lecture covered the history of the world's creation, the great beings who shaped it, and the lesser followers that came after. Once the class ended and the teacher let them go, a group of curious students immediately swarmed Allmark. They started firing off blunt questions about his missing last name, his father's job, and where his homeland was. Allmark explained he was a commoner, that his father worked as a traveling blacksmith, and that he'd enrolled late, after making the long trip from Arnetti in the far north past the Forda Kingdom. His classmates were floored by the distance, pointing out his home was even farther than the Manoba Strait, way up in the true north. When a girl asked what he actually made as a blacksmith, he said swords, and shocked the group even more by admitting he'd made the whole trip to the academy completely alone. The group buzzed loudly over his solo journey, until a girl with hair ribbons took charge and started introducing everyone. A boy named Morgan from a village village out west said he was a woodcutter's son, followed by Nelson, whose father served as a knight's attendant in the neighboring kingdom of Mikes. Next came Norish from the southern Lang kingdom and her roommate Lily, whose parents worked as musicians at a royal academy. They introduced Wendy Bahab, daughter of an influential noble family, though she brushed off her status modestly, right as Morgan pointed toward one last student. A boy named Torque walked up and coldly told them to move, while Morgan tried to keep things quiet and Wendy attempted to introduce Allmark anyway. Torque brushed off their friendliness as childish games and warned the commoners not to get in the noble's way, before demanding they clear a path. As the group headed to their next class, Allmark asked whether the practical magic session would be somewhere different. Torque kept up his insults, calling Allmark an amateur for not knowing a single spell yet, claiming he'd end up a burden and a joke to the upperclassmen. Morgan explained that Torque was an arrogant noble who happened to be genuinely talented in both magic and swordplay, ranking as the second strongest student in class. When Allmark asked who held the top spot, Morgan pointed out the class representative, Wallace, and urged everyone to hurry to class. The students arrived at the practice grounds and gathered for their upcoming lesson. The instructor kicked things off by having each student light a lamp using nothing but their own magic, no wand needed. As everyone focused their energy, Allmark watched in awe as his classmates pulled off magical glows right from their hands. He thought about how much more refined their technique was compared to the self-taught magicians he'd known up north. It hit him that he was surrounded by real prodigies, as the teacher kept an eye on everyone's progress. The teacher acknowledged Allmark, saying he already knew his background and told him to come to his office after school for some extra lessons. The lesson wrapped up with the teacher nodding Allmark's concentration had been off that day and questioning what was behind it. The instructor called out the students for their sloppy performance and warned them not to embarrass themselves in front of the transfer student, then told everyone to grab a wand for the next round. While checking out the practice staffs, a girl told Allmark their next task would be either wind magic or stone carving, depending on Professor Ilmes's mood. The instructor settled on stone carving and had the students gather their materials, leaving Allmark curious about how magical stone carving actually worked. Remembering street performances where stones got split with wooden staffs, he watched the exercise start as his classmates broke their stones apart with ease. Some students finished fast, while others struggled and got frustrated, though one girl stayed determined to finally pull it off. Allmark noticed a student named Wallace using an advanced technique to carve detailed patterns into the stone instead of just splitting it, drawing warnings from others to stay on task. Watching him work with that calm intensity, Allmark realized this had to be the Wallace everyone kept talking about. A tall student walked over and mockingly called him a newcomer, asking why he hadn't even started and offering to teach him, since he clearly didn't know anything. The older student told him the first step was closing his eyes and taking a deep breath to feel the magic inside his own body. When Allmark asked how you're actually supposed to feel it, the student got annoyed at his total lack of knowledge, while another classmate nearby broke down in tears over their own failure. The student told him that if he really couldn't sense any magic, he should just leave the academy, since there was no point hesitating on cutting someone with no power. To show him how, the student explained you had to picture the magic flowing through the staff and into the stone, while breathing out sharply on the strike. After easily breaking his own stone, the student told him it was that simple and encouraged him to give it a try. Allmark figured that despite the guy's attitude, he was probably telling the truth about the technique and decided trying was better than just standing around watching. He attempted to feel the magic flowing from his hands into the staff as he struck the stone, following what he'd just been told. The stone didn't budge at all, and the older student burst out laughing, saying he'd never seen anyone fail to break even a single fragment on their first try. Claiming Allmark had no talent, the student suggested he give up now, since he might get forced to leave in a year without ever advancing. Noticing Allmark's reaction, the student asked if he was being seen as some kind of enemy, clearly picking up on the tension between them. When Allmark asked if the hostility was about his noble background, the student snapped, calling him an eyesore and asking if he thought he was better than him. Introducing himself as Torque of the Seife family, the student insulted him for being an arrogant nobody, mocking his 2-year delay in enrolling despite whatever excuses he had about his circumstances. Torque warned him the world had no room for naive thinking and that he'd surely fall behind, while Allmark admitted that leaving his parents at 9 had been a hard transition. Calling the whole conversation a waste of his time, Torque walked off, while Allmark reflected reflected on how he'd managed to stay calm despite feeling like he might snap. Comparing Torque's provocation to the brutality of northern battlefields, Allmark actually found the lesson pretty mild and felt grateful for the magic he'd just witnessed, right as a girl interrupted his practice. Wendy encouraged him, saying he'd master the skill soon enough, and reminded him that teacher Ilmes wanted to see him after school. Morgan came running over toward Allmark and Wendy, waving energetically and offering to help however he could. Standing in the practice yard, Allmark thanked his friends and promised to work hard to catch up, glancing at the shattered stones around him. During lunch, his friends were stunned by how fast he ate, wondering if he'd really been that hungry or just never had enough food. Allmark realized he needed to adjust his eating habits to fit in better, before heading off to meet teacher Ilmes once afternoon classes wrapped up. After moving to a new spot for their session, the teacher opened by asking whether Allmark thought a staff or robe was required to use magic. Allmark assumed they were necessary, since every magician he'd met on his long trip to the academy had been equipped with them. Ilmes told him to forget all that, explaining those items were mostly for show, and that real magicians were defined by the invisible power they carried. The teacher stressed that the true heart of magic lies entirely in what you can't see, a concept Allmark would need to grasp if he wanted to study there. Acknowledging his sharp instincts, Ilmes clarified that the range of magic he'd be teaching didn't require any outside tools to master. Though meditation was standard for elementary students, Ilmes told Allmark that as a third year he didn't have time to waste and needed to start refining his inner power right away. Coming out of the session after dark, Allmark found Morgan and Nelson waiting for him, since Wendy had worried he might get lost on his way to the dorms. The group explained they'd already been nearby for their own forest training and stuck around to look for him, since it was his first day. As they walked back, Morgan complained about being hungry while the boys talked about how excited everyone had been earlier that day. Reaching their rooms, Allmark said goodnight, realizing he still needed to memorize all the names and faces he'd been introduced to. Alone in his room, Allmark tried to sense the magic inside himself, comparing the feeling to a mass of flowing water at his core, just like the teacher had described. Thinking about how this inward focus reminded him of the solitude from his long journey, he braced himself for the busy days ahead. He spent his free time studying in the library to keep up with the tough classes, and even though Wendy helped him, he knew he couldn't lean on her forever. He chose to meditate on his own like teacher Ilmes suggested, politely turning down help from others, until he felt ready and time started moving fast. During a magic lesson right before a day off, the class practiced light magic, while Allmark recalled the professor's advice that magic runs on imagination. He struggled to picture how to turn his inner power into physical light, failing to even produce a small flame in his hand. The instructor demonstrated wind magic next, stirring up a gentle breeze that shook a small tree. Looking around, Allmark noticed everyone had different strengths. Some, like Torque and Morgan, struggled, while others, like Wendy and Julia, nailed every spell. He noticed Wallace kept to himself, avoiding conversation on purpose, despite being clearly respected by everyone else. After a classmate mentioned Wallace was a noble son, Allmark refocused on the lesson to make sure he didn't fall behind. Feeling like he had a better grip on his magic now, he tried the light spell again, picturing a small flame gathering in his palm. It actually started to work, but the tiny light suddenly warped and turned into something way more intense. A massive pillar of fire tore through the room, shocking everyone as they screamed his name in terror. The towering blaze took over the whole hall, leaving everyone in a state of panic and confusion. As the heat grew and Allmark started to fade, the teacher watched the dying flames and noted that this was exactly what he'd expected. Allmark woke up in the infirmary without a single burn, feeling like a failure for passing out so easily. His whole body felt drained as he tried to move, and the teacher quickly told him to stay put. Teacher Ilmes explained he'd had to release the excess magic from the boy's body, and pointed out the spell hadn't been light magic at all. He identified the spell as Dragon Flame, a destructive technique meant to burn enemies to ash, though thankfully nobody else got hurt. When asked why it happened, Allmark said he'd only pictured a small flame, but the teacher reminded him his power was still completely untrained. Ilmes warned that Dragon Flame was a high-level spell meant for much older students, way too dangerous for someone as green as him. The teacher concluded that, while Allmark was clever at picking things up, using such draining magic without the right capacity could easily get him killed. Right before passing out, Allmark remembered a man once telling him that interpreting magic your own way just leads to arrogance. While resting in the infirmary, the teacher told told him to spend the next 2 days focused purely on recovering his magic and to stop all meditation training. Allmark apologized for the trouble and was told a healing mage named Syria would bring him medicine soon. The teacher encouraged him to take it slow and not rush, even though he'd mentioned before there wasn't much time to catch up. He assured Allmark the power was already within him, then left for the day. Syria showed up with a jar of dark medicine and told him to drink all of it to fix his dizziness. As he swallowed it down, he could feel his magic slowly building back up inside him. Before leaving, she gave one last warning that he had to stay in his room for 2 more days to properly recover. Left alone, Allmark wondered if he should head back to the dorm soon anyway. Seeing that classes had already ended, he planned to apologize to everyone at dinner, realizing tomorrow would be his first day off. Eventually, he decided to get out of bed and head for the door. The moment he opened it, he found his worried friends waiting right there. He felt a pang of regret, realizing he'd have to cancel his plan to go pick up books in town with Wendy. Wendy rushed over and grabbed his face to check for injuries, telling him how worried she'd been. Flustered by the attention, he still felt relieved as the group welcomed him back. Allmark gave a sincere apology for losing control of the flames and putting everyone at risk. His friends laughed it off, admitting they'd all struggled with control at first too, sometimes creating fire pillars or nearly burning themselves. The group swapped stories about their own past failures, including the time someone accidentally set Torque's hair on fire. They mentioned even quiet little Lily could pull off unbelievable things when she lost control. One girl pointed out that his flame had actually been the most impressive one in their whole grade, accident aside. They encouraged him not to hold back going forward since everyone messes up, especially as freshmen. Wendy took his hand and offered to help him anytime he needed it, since his training was stuck at just meditation for now. Touched by their support, Allmark thanked his friends for everything. He told Wendy he wouldn't be able to keep their plans for the next day, and the group understood completely. They offered to bring him textbooks instead, though one of them seemed more interested in a trip to the candy store. The group said their goodbyes and headed off to finish their own tasks for the day. Allmark closed the door with a smile, genuinely grateful to have met such great friends at the academy. In a quiet moment, Allmark found Julia and apologized for losing control, but she responded coldly, comparing him to a monkey and accusing him of betraying everyone by using power he couldn't handle. Julia kept up her harsh criticism, saying the whole class had turned into a mess because of him alone. She demanded he stop disrupting their lessons before walking off, leaving him alone in the woods. The next day, Allmark stayed in his room as instructed, until Wendy showed up at his door with a big stack of books, offering to help him catch up since he was confined all day. Allmark accepted, and Wendy excitedly suggested they study together in the library so she could get her own work done too. As they studied, Wendy breezed through every hard question, proving herself to be a top student. After lunch, Allmark finally asked her why she was always so kind to him. Wendy admitted she'd originally thought he didn't understand anything since he was new to the school. Allmark felt a little guilty, but she reassured him she helped him simply because she wanted to. Wendy told him it was actually her group's fault Torque had targeted him on his first day, explaining they'd all agreed to protect him as much as they could, which just left him confused about why he'd need protecting at all. Looking at her, Allmark realized he must come across as someone in need of help in these kids' eyes. He thought back to his trek across the Manoba Strait and thanked Wendy for her kindness. He reassured her that even if he seemed unreliable, he could handle protecting himself and appreciated everything they'd done for him. Wendy quickly clarified she never meant to call him weak, and he expressed genuine gratitude for their support. Allmark asked why Torque kept picking on him, but Wendy shifted the conversation to the social makeup of their class, asking for his take on the mix of students with and without last names. Wendy pointed out that unlike other classes, theirs had barely any aristocrats. Only 4 students carried surnames, while the other 12, including him, were commoners. It was clear Torque resented being stuck in a class full of commoners. Allmark asked if nobility even mattered at the academy, and Wendy agreed it shouldn't. She mentioned that despite the school's stance on equality, some students still believed nobles were just better. Allmark pointed out that the 4 nobles happening to be the class's top performers only fed that biased idea. Wendy talked about how forceful Torque could be toward commoners, then conjured a small magic orb in her hand. Allmark watched, surprised, as she declared that social status meant nothing next to the power of magic. The comparison of magic to a balanced scale drove home the point that this power was equal for everyone. Allmark took the truth of it in as he silently silently watched the display. Wendy admitted she'd once wanted to switch classes but felt powerless to actually do it. She lowered her head briefly in frustration before looking back up to share a specific memory. She remembered the moment Allmark first walked into the classroom, how impressed she'd been by his confidence, knowing no one and having zero magic skill yet still walking in with determined eyes. Wendy specifically remembered the exact second their eyes met that day. Allmark smiled, telling her he remembered it too and was glad to hear her side of it. Looking out the window, Wendy admitted she'd had this baseless hunch that the new kid might be the one to actually change things around here. Embarrassed, she looked down and apologized for the strange comments, explaining her only goal had been to help him fit in as fast as possible. She quickly added that Torque had his good sides too, worried she sounded like she was just trashing him. Allmark listened quietly, finding the whole conversation kind of strange. Privately, Allmark reflected that he had no plans to leave the class, admitting to himself that just keeping up with the daily lessons was already a massive struggle. He felt like he had no room left to worry about the social side of things, but was caught off guard when Wendy suddenly grabbed his sleeve. He turned to find her crying silently. Seeing her tears, Allmark realized just how much trouble Wendy had dealt with on his behalf since he'd arrived. Feeling a deep sense of debt, he resolved to repay her kindness somehow. A snowy memory flashed through his mind as he heard his name called out in the distance. Allmark thought back to his father's words about how mercenaries value gratitude and how betrayal leads to death. Remembering his father's advice never to let someone underestimate him if they'd made a woman cry, he braced himself to show his true strength. Allmark mentioned to Wendy that there was a martial arts class scheduled for the next day. Sitting together, Wendy realized this would be Allmark's very first time in a martial arts session. Allmark suddenly asked her to drop the formal honorific, saying it reminded him of a past he wanted to leave behind, and Wendy was visibly shaken by the intensity in his eyes. He quickly snapped back to his usual cheerful self and promised to show his gratitude during class the next day. The scene shifted to the academy arena, where the sound of training echoed through the whole structure. Allmark confronted Torque with a bold bet, saying he'd leave the academy if he lost, but demanding Torque obey his orders if he won. Torque mocked him for being scared, aggressively accepting the challenge and vowing this would be the last time he'd have to see his face, while the other students watched on, uneasy. Back in the library, his friends called him over to get moving, and Allmark packed away his books to join them. The group arrived at the martial arts arena to kick off their training session for the day. They talked about the upcoming annual tournament, a huge event attended by King Galai and plenty of distinguished guests. As a girl explained that only third years took part in the tournament, Torque cut in to insult the newcomers, calling them mannerless northern barbarians. His friends noticed how tense Torque got about his martial arts skills and worried about his rough style, right as the teacher walked up. Instructor Bowen introduced himself and pointed out Allmark as the new student, telling him he had potential but needed to just watch the practice for now. The instructor started the session, and Allmark was surprised to see everyone fighting with very thin, specialized swords. He thought about how northern mercenaries would never use blades that thin, since they'd be useless against heavy armor, axes, or spears in real combat. It dawned on him that for these students, fighting was just a form of education, not a life-or-death situation, as he watched them trade blows in their padded armor. Wallace won his match with ease, and Allmark noticed that even the girls in class moved with real skill. Wendy and Julia traded a rapid series of strikes, showing off their precision and speed with the thin blades. The two girls praised each other's technique after the match, while Allmark watched from the sidelines, nodding how much fun they seemed to be having. The aggressive student suddenly called Allmark out, demanding he step forward since he wouldn't tolerate any weaklings in the class. Torque asked if he'd packed his things to leave, but Allmark shot back that his strength wasn't anyone else's call to make. Even though Torque and his friend clearly found him annoying, Allmark firmly said he wasn't leaving, not after it had taken him 2 years just to get there. Disgusted by his story, Torque questioned whether it was just some tale meant to make him look better, but Allmark saw no reason to lie. Growing more irritated by his cheekiness, Torque grudgingly admitted the strength of southern magic while still refusing to call northerners barbarians. As Torque brought up how mercenaries had spent decades killing each other like common bandits, he noticed the way Allmark reacted and smirked, realizing he'd struck a nerve. While watching others train nearby, Torque challenged the boy he called a barbarian, saying just watching was enough to get the blood pumping, and offered to be his opponent. Torque confirmed they had the teacher's permission to spar, pointing out that Allmark was just standing around doing nothing, while the instructor kept urging the other students to fight harder. After a tired sigh, Allmark accepted the challenge but made a specific request about armor, prompting Torque to tell a student named Galeen to lend him some gear. Galeen handed over the armor with a smirk, and once Allmark thanked him and finished suiting up, he apologized for the wait, only for Torque to dismiss him as some bumpkin from the north. Torque insisted the school was no place for barbarians and told him to go back to his own country, questioning why he was even there with no magic to speak of. Allmark countered that he'd been officially accepted, but Torque flat out refused to believe it. As Torque lunged at him, shouting his refusal to accept him, Allmark barely dodged the strike, caught off guard. The sudden clash between Torque and Allmark drew the attention of everyone nearby, who watched in confusion as the two traded a fast flurry of footwork and strikes. Torque threw out an insult, but Allmark stayed calm, asking if he was really a noble given how vulgar his language was, which only made Torque angrier. Allmark wondered how far he should push his opponent, remembering he'd already made up his mind to fight the day before, though he kept an eye on the watching teacher. Noticing the teacher had no intention of stopping the fight, Allmark suspected the academy director might have had a hand in it, while Torque warned him not to get cocky just for dodging one hit. While Wendy watched with worry, her friend promised to return a favor and noted that Allmark had the eyes of a seasoned mercenary, right as Torque lost his temper and threatened to kill him. Allmark mockingly told him not to say such scary things, suggesting Torque might be the real barbarian instead of a noble, adding that he wasn't nearly as strong as he claimed to be. Allmark asked if that was really the best he had, and Torque screamed another insult as he thrust his sword forward. But Allmark easily kept his distance from the blade. As Torque's frustration boiled over, aiming for his face, throat, and chest, Allmark tracked and dodged every single strike with precision. The crowd was stunned by the display, some wondering if Torque was just having a bad day, others realizing Allmark was simply too skilled for him to land even one hit. Realizing Allmark knew exactly how to dodge every attack, Torque, out of pure desperation, called him a coward for constantly running away. Ending his defensive stance, Allmark lunged forward and landed a clean hit on Torque's chest plate, calmly pointing out that he'd finally made contact. After Allmark won the duel, Torque angrily called it a fluke, while a classmate criticized him for having no honor, prompting Allmark to propose a rematch under specific terms. One of the onlookers noted he was still in good shape as he laid out a high-stakes bet, promising to leave the academy if he lost this time too. Allmark set his winning condition, demanding an end to all discrimination between nobles and commoners, then taunted Torque by asking if he was scared of losing to him. Furious at the challenge, Torque accepted the deal, swearing this would be the last time he'd ever have to look at Allmark's face. With the terms locked in, the two took their stances as the second round of the duel began. Torque stared him down with murderous intent, while Allmark held a steady guard as they prepared to fight. As the standoff dragged on, Allmark noticed Torque's hesitant movements starting to clash with his aggressive attitude. The onlookers grew more nervous as they realized Torque wasn't managing to launch any real offense. Struggling to find an opening in the second round, Torque realized with frustration that Allmark's defense was completely airtight. Confusion set in for Torque when he couldn't sense any hostility or killing intent from Allmark as the boy closed the distance. Allmark suddenly closed the gap and drove a powerful thrust straight into the center of Torque's chest. The impact sent Torque crashing backward onto the floor, leaving the crowd of students speechless at how fast it ended. Torque was thrown across the room with such force that his weapon flew completely out of his hand. Dazed on the ground, Torque wondered how he'd been hit so easily as Allmark set his training sword aside and walked toward him. Torque groaned in pain while Allmark stood over him, ready to finalize their bet. Grabbing Torque by the collar, Allmark firmly declared his victory, demanding he fulfill his promise right then and there. Turning back to the rest of the class, Allmark reminded everyone that discrimination between nobles and commoners had no place among classmates. Torque gritted his teeth in frustration, but Allmark kept holding him in place, waiting for a spoken commitment. Allmark commanded Torque to swear on his family name that he'd uphold his end of the bargain. In one final display of authority, Allmark made Torque swear on the name of Seife that he'd never discriminate against anyone again. The group watched in silence as the duel came to an end, both boys sprawled on the ground, out of breath. The boy who'd lost the fight gritted his teeth in pure frustration, still trying to process the defeat. The winner looked down at his opponent, delivered one final solemn oath, then let go of his grip and let the tension fade away. The rest of the students rushed toward the center of the field to celebrate the unexpected win. As the crowd praised Allmark for his strength and wondered how he'd trained, He turned to Wendy and told her he'd finally returned the favor. Wiping away her tears, Wendy looked up with a relieved smile and quietly thanked him. Seeing her reaction, Allmark realized this simple moment of acknowledgement was exactly what he'd been hoping for. He smiled back and asked if what he'd done had been enough to repay even a little of what he felt he owed her. Their classmates quickly gathered around them again, eager to train together, while the instructor and another student watched from a distance. Turning back to Torque, Allmark demanded he swear on his family name and the name Seife that he'd never discriminate against commoners again. Torque gave his word right as the instructor stepped in to signal the confrontation had gone far enough. The teacher warned both of them against turning his classroom into a battlefield, checking them for injuries, before turning it into a teaching moment. He explained that while martial arts had once been vital for survival during wartime, it had since become a standard part of their education. Drawing his blade, he made it clear combat wasn't a game but a pursuit of quick victory, and that a real drive to win was a necessary trait. He acknowledged that Torque's underlying ideas weren't wrong, but criticized him for poisoning his technique with hatred instead of respect for his opponent. The instructor warned Torque that without mutual respect, a fighter's skills would always stay surface level, and told him to reflect on his actions. He then turned to Allmark, pointing out that even though he'd won, he'd been up against an opponent far weaker in actual skill. The teacher condemned Allmark's use of traps and provocation to humiliate a classmate, calling the method despicable no matter how noble the goal. He decided to give Allmark a one-time pass for it since his intentions had been right, and Allmark gave a humble thank you. Still, the instructor added with a sharp look that what really bothered him was Allmark using his class as a stage for a personal scheme. Mr. Bowen assigned Allmark cleanup duty for the martial arts arena for the whole year, insisting personal conflicts should get settled somewhere other than his class. As Allmark hauled a heavy crate away, a girl complained about how slow he was and told him to walk slower. The bickering over his pace kept going until Mr. Bowen stepped in, explaining that if everyone pitched in, the punishment would lose its whole point. Before dismissing him, he told Allmark to report to the principal's office after school, leaving the boy confused as he agreed. After school ended, Allmark headed to the principal's office, realizing he hadn't seen the man since his very first day at the academy. He reached the big door, knocked, and announced himself. The principal looked up from his desk, buried under piles of documents, as Allmark walked in. He welcomed the boy into the office to start their meeting. Asked how he liked life at the academy, Allmark answered positively. Though the principal admitted he'd already gotten several reports from the teachers, he said he wanted to hear Allmark's own take on everything that had happened so far. Allmark launched into a detailed rundown covering his time in class, the struggles with magic, the failed light spell, and the special training that followed. He touched on Wendy's distress, his run-ins with Torque, and everything that went down in martial arts class, mixing in his own thoughts along the way. The principal listened the whole time without interrupting, nodding here and there and letting out the occasional small laugh. He finally set his pen down, a sign he'd taken it all in. The principal admitted he was surprised someone Allmark's age could pull off Dragon Flame and still walk home the same day. Allmark stayed humble, crediting Ilmi Sensei and Syria Sensei for getting him through it. He went on to credit Wendy and Morgan too, admitting he couldn't have handled any of it alone. The principal told him to hold on to that, explaining that both learning magic and forming real friendships mattered just as much for his growth, stressing that neglecting either his studies or his friendships would slow him down as a future magician. The principal shifted to something more practical, asking with a lighter tone if he had enough money for his needs. The academy covered most necessities like meals, uniforms, and housing for free, plus a small monthly allowance for extras. Allmark admitted he hadn't touched any of it yet, but the principal told him never to hesitate asking for help given how much he still felt he owed the boy's father. Leaving the office, Allmark was surprised to find his friends waiting in the hallway. They explained they'd followed him after Morgan said he'd been summoned to the headmaster's office, all of them visibly on edge. The group admitted they'd been worried he might be facing serious punishment or even expulsion, but he quickly reassured them nothing like that had happened. He explained that since it had been 10 days since he enrolled, the principal just wanted to check in on how he was settling in. One of the boys immediately turned on Morgan, accusing him of exaggerating the whole thing. Morgan desperately defended himself, insisting he'd only said Allmark was called to the office, not that there was actually a problem. Watching his friends bicker, Allmark realized this kind of selfless concern was a rare thing compared to how he grew up in the North. He felt genuinely grateful for their worry and realized he'd finally become a true part of the class as they all headed back together. Later that day, Allmark reflected on how the group's dynamic had shifted. Nodding, Morgan seemed happy, while Torque kept up his usual arrogant act. Still, Allmark hoped Torque would at least keep the promise he'd made. Things in the classroom stayed mostly the same. Julia still kept to herself, and Wallace was kind to everyone except Allmark. Still, Allmark noticed Torque had gotten a little quieter, finally dropping the peasant and barbarian comments. The next morning, Wendy greeted Allmark right as Morgan burst into the room in a total panic, insisting something terrible had happened, describing a mysterious shadow he swore had been following him all morning. His friends quickly figured out the source of his terror, pointing out the shadow he'd seen was just his own. Morgan was left red-faced as everyone laughed at his needless fear. Trying to explain his jumpiness, Morgan admitted he'd accidentally fallen back asleep after breakfast and had to rush to school alone. Racing through the empty grounds, a sudden movement in the trees had spooked him into mistaking a rabbit, or maybe just a shadow, for something far more threatening. Morgan checked out the shadow between the trees but found nothing there, first suspecting a rabbit, before writing it off as his imagination and continuing his run. Back at the academy, he told his story to skeptical classmates, since he'd only caught a split-second glimpse of the shadow, though he still wondered if it could have been a monster. Wendy admitted she was curious, while Allmark learned monsters were rarely spotted near the academy compared to up north, leading the group to figure Morgan was just being overly cautious. Wendy asked Allmark if the sighting worried him, but he was mostly just relieved he'd made it to class on time, while Morgan sighed in resignation. Allmark told Wendy his upbringing up north made him more attuned to monsters, and she reassured him his perspective wasn't strange at all, saying she'd like to hear more of his stories. Thinking back on grim memories of war and death, Allmark told Wendy he really had no special stories to share, and she quietly let it go without pushing further. The class enjoyed a brief moment of free study when the teacher ran late, but everyone quickly settled down once the instructor walked in and started the lesson. One hot afternoon, after school, Allmark noticed Lily heading into the forest alone and wondered why someone known for getting easily spooked would go there at that hour. Knowing entering the forest after sunset needed permission and that most students were already at dinner, Allmark decided to follow her to see what she was up to. He startled her by calling out her name and immediately warned her the forest was dangerous at night, asking why she was even there. Allmark offered to tag along, since they'd both be late for dinner anyway, but Lily hesitated to explain what she was really doing out there alone. Lily admitted she'd lost a precious handkerchief her parents had given her, and even after Allmark suggested waiting until morning, she insisted on searching right away because of how much it mattered to her. Allmark struggled to follow her quiet explanation, catching something about not being able to sleep, nodding that her usual companion wasn't there to help translate. Losing her patience, Lily shouted that she couldn't sleep without the handkerchief, admitting she'd been too embarrassed to explain earlier how much she relied on it. Allmark apologized for teasing her and listened as she explained the keepsake had gotten her through lonely nights when she'd first arrived at the academy with no friends. She said the handkerchief was the only thing keeping her from crying herself to sleep, and sternly warned him not to laugh at her for admitting it. Allmark reassured her that everyone has things that matter to them like that, bringing up his own mother's keepsake, and promised they'd find it together once she stopped apologizing for the outburst. Allmark confirmed the handkerchief was white to help narrow the search, while Lily used a small burst of magical light to help illuminate the forest floor. Watching her use magic so naturally, Allmark wondered if he'd ever be able to do the same before refocusing on the search. Lily pointed to a large, vine-covered tree where she'd been gathering herbs, figuring she must have dropped the handkerchief when she pulled out her knife. A floating lantern and a tiny spirit talked about splitting up to search, before the scene shifted to the boy and girl in the forest where he apologized for almost leaving her behind. Allmark asked Lilte to check a bush she'd already looked through, but a sudden noise from the thicket startled her right into his arms, until they realized it was just falling nuts. Looking down at the nuts on the ground, he noted that things get a lot less scary once you actually know the source, though he warned they still had to stay alert. He picked one up and told her that keeping your eyes open matters most, since panic is the real danger whenever you're afraid. When he asked if she was too scared to keep going, Lilte decided to push on a little longer, and he promised he'd stay with her until they were done. Their search finally paid off when Lilte found what they were looking for, excitedly showing him the cloth. They looked over the dark fabric, noting how its color had made it so hard to spot, and as they got ready to head back, Lilte thanked Allmark for coming with her. Allmark praised her for showing real courage during the search, though Lilte felt he was being way too generous with the compliment. She insisted his presence was the only reason she'd succeeded, but Allmark shot back that the credit belonged to her for deciding to search in the first place. Their conversation got cut off by a string of strange rustling noises coming from the surrounding trees. Allmark didn't recognize the sound at all, but Lilte knew it as a common northern omen called the time of the beasts and urged an immediate retreat. Overwhelmed with fear, Lilte grabbed his hand as he realized they'd wandered into territory where humans weren't welcome anymore. Admitting his own fear and his inability to protect her out there, Allmark led a desperate sprint out of the forest, until they finally reached a clearing where they could stop and catch their breath. As they recovered, a figure named Nelson showed up and signaled to a larger group that Allmark and Lilte had been found safe. A girl named Norish hugged Lilte in relief, while the others explained they'd joined the search after she failed to return to her room. Allmark explained they'd run into each other by chance after a tutoring session, leading Nelson to praise Lilte's dedication, while Muzin joked their late-night adventure wasn't exactly something to brag about. Before parting ways, Lilte returned the lamp to Allmark and asked him to keep finding the handkerchief a secret between them. Nelson mentioned how many classmates had joined the search, remarking on how the class pulled together in a crisis, though he pointed out one student, Wallace, still hadn't come back. Allmark decided to stick around and wait for Wallace, seeing it as a rare chance to finally talk to a classmate he'd never really interacted with. The group headed back to the dorms, wishing him luck, leaving him alone as a lone figure finally emerged from the building in the distance. Wallace greeted the group as they reached the stairs and, while he confirmed he and Lilte were safe, they thanked Wallace for waiting despite his usual cold silence. He made a cryptic remark that the forest was crying, then moved on without another word. That left Allmark confused as Wallace brushed past him and disappeared back into the building with a heavy slam of the door. Alone now, Allmark realized how hungry he was. After missing dinner and thought back on his survival days in the wild, worrying his old instincts were getting dull thanks to academy life. He decided to ask Muzin for food and walked up to a door, only to be caught off guard by Wendy, who appeared right as he was about to knock. Wendy said she'd heard about his late return with Lilte and offered him some extra snacks she'd bought, insisting he'd actually be doing her a favor by eating them. He gratefully accepted, and after she recommended the star-shaped treats, they said their goodnights. As he started eating, a second knock came from Lilte, who'd also brought him food to make up for the dinner he'd missed. With more snacks than he knew what to do with, Allmark felt a small sense of comfort that night, though he couldn't shake the eerie sound still echoing in his mind from the forest. He remembered his father's warnings that the sound signaled dangerous creatures emerging once the forest hit its darkest point. These monsters were known for wiping out entire groups of soldiers without a trace, and just the memory of them still filled him with dread. Realizing he was currently unarmed and unable to protect anyone, he vowed to keep up both his meditation and his daily sword maintenance. The next morning, he thought about reporting the strange sound to his professors but held back since he hadn't actually seen a monster with his own eyes. On his way to school, Allmark got stopped by two younger students, Eld and Shiri, who immediately asked if he'd finally learned any magic. The two kids were shocked that a third year still couldn't cast a single spell, feeling sorry for him since they'd first met back in meditation class. Shiri and Eld proudly showed off their own mist magic and encouraged him to keep working on his basics so he could catch up. Their conversation got interrupted by Torque, who mocked his friend for having to babysit a kid like Allmark so early in the day. Torque called his inability to cast spells pathetic, mockingly suggesting the younger kids ought to be the ones teaching him instead. Feeling bad for him, Eld and Shiri decided to start a little club to help Allmark out, convinced he just had bad luck ending up in a class full of mean people. Once his own classes wrapped up, Allmark checked in with Muzin to see if he'd told anyone else about the strange shadow, and Muzin confirmed he'd kept it quiet to avoid getting mocked. Muzin explained to Allmark that he'd seen a black shadow rustling in the bushes, bigger than himself, admitting how terrified the encounter had left him, while Allmark listened closely, nodding he could always tell if someone was lying just by looking in their eyes. Allmark backed up his story, pointing out that if it had just been a trick of the eye, the bushes wouldn't have actually moved, confirming to Muzin that something really had been there. They kept talking as Allmark asked for more details about the fleeting shadow, since estimating size in a split second is tricky. Muzin insisted the creature had definitely been a bit taller than him. Surprised his story was actually being taken seriously, Muzin remembered a new detail: long claws on the the shadow that he hadn't mentioned before. When Allmark offered to bring the teachers in on it, Muzin turned him down, saying just being heard was enough for him, and headed back. A girl joined Allmark and asked about his private talk with Muzin, suggesting the other boy might just be too kind or too unsure of himself to speak up on his own. While the group finished gathering herbs for class, Allmark noticed someone sprinting toward them in a panic from the edge of the woods. Shiri came running in tears, desperately calling out for Allmark, struggling to explain what had happened to Eld. She said a monster had taken Eld in broad daylight, and it immediately reminded Allmark of the shadow Muzin had described earlier near the forest's edge. Allmark told Shiri to pull herself together and give him the details he needed to save Eld, promising he'd bring their friend back safely. Shiri described the creature as a brown, furry beast with horns about the size of a middle schooler, and Allmark headed straight into the woods while sending her off to find a teacher. A student named Torque showed up and questioned what Allmark was doing with the first year, only to be told Eld had just been taken by a monster. Allmark asked Torque to look after Shiri and get help, while he went ahead alone to rescue Eld and take down the creature if it came to that. As Allmark sprinted toward the forest, Torque's group stood there stunned by the plan, prompting Torque to order the others to follow Shiri and fetch a teacher. Torque criticized Allmark's recklessness for charging into the dangerous forest alone with no magic and no knowledge of the area. Realizing the danger, Torque decided he had no choice but to follow, just as a massive furry beast was spotted carrying the child deep into the woods. The kid snaps off a tree branch to use as a makeshift weapon while Torque finally catches up, grumbling about how fast he's moving and explaining he'd left the others behind to escort a first-year student. Torque's getting frustrated now, asking if the plan is really for the kid to go face the monster alone while he gets sent off to fetch a teacher. Torque isn't about to be treated like some coward. A junior's been kidnapped, so he's joining the search, and he's not about to leave this to someone who doesn't know the forest or a lick of magic. They go back and forth for a second, a mercenary's way of thinking against a knight's pride, but Torque finally agrees. They're heading into the woods together. Once they're in the trees, Torque tells him to stay sharp. The monster nests have to be deeper in, further from the shallow parts of the forest. Torque points them toward the practice clearing to pick up the tracks, but the kid takes off running before he even finishes talking, leaving Torque struggling to keep up again. At the clearing, the kid spots a bag someone dropped belongs to a kid named Eld, and figures a witness named Shiri must been scared out of her mind by whatever she saw. They check out the footprints while Torque brushes off Muzin's earlier sighting as some tall tale. The kid isn't so sure though. A clawed creature sounds real enough to him. Looking at the tracks and the description of one horn and one eye, he figures out exactly what they're dealing with. A Jaranin, a brutally strong forest ogre. That actually brings some relief. These things go after fresh prey and usually drag their victims back to the lair alive, which means Eld's got a real shot at still being out there. Torque's surprised he knows all this, but the kid just shrugs it off, says he learned it the hard way out of pure survival. Then they push on deeper, racing the dark. Torque tells him flat out to stop running off on his own, that he's got a mage backing him up, and starts winding up a spell to help with the search. The kid watches quietly, kind of impressed by how precise Torque's fingers move as he pulls a glowing bit of magic out of thin air. Torque explains the spell tracks beasts by scent, lighting the trail up yellow so they can follow it a lot easier. Somewhere else in the forest, Muzin runs into Deg and Galeen, who want to know what's going on with the missing kid. Nobody's seen a monster in these woods in years, so the whole thing feels off, and it's got them worried Allmark and Torque might do something reckless. Muzin's eaten up with regret for not telling the teachers sooner. Turns out his friends doubted him the first time he mentioned seeing something. Guilt over freezing up when he first heard the bushes rustle finally pushes him to head into the forest himself and make it right. The glowing yellow trail runs past deep claw marks gouged into the trees, marking exactly where the creature tore through the woods. Torque gets caught off guard as the terrain turns rough, forcing the two of them to squeeze through fallen logs and thick brush while they close in on their target. The chase keeps going, and a young guy running behind can't help but wonder what kind of training builds that kind of stamina and strength. A first year's life is on the line, so he knows he's got to catch up fast, and it hits him that the one ahead isn't just great at magic, he's good at everything. Even when they talk magic, this guy feels like he's falling further behind, struggling just to hold it together. For a second he's back in a hallway, alone, thinking about the gap between them before he snaps out of it and keeps chasing. Watching that back stay ahead of him in the distance, he's scared that one day he'll lag behind in magic the same way he's lagging behind right right now. He can already picture the day he'll be chasing that same back and everything else too. Eyes burning with determination, he keeps pushing through the burning lungs and the exhaustion. He knows one thing for sure, he can't let that gap get any wider. He remembers the cold looks people used to give him, remembers swearing he'd throw those same looks right back one day. He'd promised himself he'd hold nothing back to get strong enough to matter. He feels completely miserable, like whatever talent or effort he thought he had means nothing right now. So he decides to stop caring what other people think and just run toward his own kind of confidence. Watching that steady pace ahead of him, he realizes some things are just talent, plain and simple. Still, even swallowing the humiliation of where he's at now, he clenches his fist and refuses to quit. He keeps his speed up through the thick brush, knowing his magic's still nowhere close to his friends. He remembers the promise he made never to be the guy who has to ask someone to slow down for him. Gripping his head for a second under all that pressure, he reaffirms his resolve, swearing it in Shifei's name. Torque finally catches up and notices the spell hasn't wavered once through the whole chase. The blonde kid praises him for keeping pace so well, and Torque immediately asks if the first year is still safe. The blonde kid tells him the kid should be fine since they've made it this far, then says he's taking over from here. He sprints off with wild speed, leaving Torque behind to catch his breath after the whole pursuit. Near the edge of the forest, a boy named Muzin is shaking, even though he knows this path like the back of his hand. He knows Allmark and Torque are already out there chasing the monsters, and he's desperate to help even though he's terrified. A student named Wallace walks up and asks why he looks so pale, so out of character. Muzin points frantically toward the trees, explaining it's serious, monsters have shown up. Wallace is shocked since monsters have never come around here before, but Muzin admits he saw a shadow days ago and blames himself for staying quiet about it. Wallace listens as he explains that Allmark and Torque went to save a kidnapped first year while the others went for help. Muzin admits he made it this far but just doesn't have the nerve to go into the forest alone. Wallace puts a hand on his shoulder, tells him that was the right call, and says he should head back while Wallace goes in his place. Wallace tells him chasing monsters without the strength to back it up isn't bravery, it's recklessness, and it'd just make him a burden out there. Muzin looks down, realizing there really was nothing more he could've done. Wallace tells him not to beat himself up over it, everyone's got their own strengths and weaknesses. With that, he tells Muzin to leave the rest to him and disappears into the trees. Deep in the forest, a massive one-eyed monster crashes through the brush, nearly stomping a student who's down on the ground. The thing lets out a heavy thud as it lands near the fallen boy, who can only stare up at that giant eye looming over him. A young kid stands his ground in front of the towering, furry beast armed with nothing but a big wooden club. The two of them lock in a tense standoff, the monster glaring down at its tiny opponent. Torque watches in shock as the kid slips on the rocky ground but keeps dashing forward anyway, still trying to distract the monster, one they're calling Jalanan, and keep it away from Eld. Torque can't help but wonder what's driving his friend's body like this. The kid hesitates for a beat, facing down a one-eyed monster whose strikes hit way harder than anything he ever dealt with in combat class. He dodges a swipe and fires back with a heavy blow, thinking that if he had his real sword, this thing would've already lost its head. This stick just feels too light for the job. Even after taking a direct hit, the monster roars back with way more resilience than expected, forcing him to stay on the defensive. Watching from a safe distance, a man holding a child decides to back off further, figuring the kid can handle the beast on his own. Then things turn ugly. A second monster comes out of the trees and the kid doesn't even notice, putting him at real risk of getting surrounded. The man grits his teeth, furious with himself for ever getting involved in this mess in the first place. He screams out a warning to the boy, calling him Allmark, just as the second creature launches a sneak attack from behind. Allmark spins around to find himself caught between two growling monsters, while the man curses his own hesitation for letting the kid fall right into this trap. To the man's shock, Allmark dodges the strike from behind so fast it's almost impossible to follow with the naked eye. He immediately fires back with two crushing hits to the monster's face, proving he's a lot tougher than he looks, while both creatures keep growling in anger. Realizing he has to step in, the man prepares a rough spell called Flame Finger, worried Allmark might get caught in the crossfire. He lets it fly anyway, telling himself that if you can't dodge a hit that big, that's on you. 3 clean shots of fire slam into the monsters, and Allmark notices the flames already starting to eat away away at his enemies. The man admits his control slipped a bit, but he justifies using fire since it's the most effective way to deal with beasts like these, while Allmark gets into position for a follow-up. With the monsters still reeling from the heat, Allmark lunges in to deliver the finishing blow. He drives the wooden branch straight into the creature's eye with a sickening crunch, and the man just watches, stunned by how brutal it looks. Blood splatters as the weapon buries itself deep in the skull, leaving the man shaken by just how cold and efficient the kid was in ending the fight. With one monster down, Allmark realizes his branch has snapped and his flames already burned out, leaving him weaponless against the last creature. The man's ready to jump in with magic again, but stops cold when he sees Allmark's already got a nut in his hand, wondering when the kid even had time to pick that up. Before the man can react, Allmark closes the distance and grabs the last monster by its fur, setting up his next move. The kid strains against the massive one-eyed creature, managing to grab a fistful of its thick fur even as the beast stumbles from the impact. The monster's clawed hand hits the dirt as its strength starts to fail. After one last pained groan from the beast, the kid looks down with a grim look on his face. He drives his hands deep into the creature's hide, and there's a sharp snap as he punches straight through its defenses. Blood splatters across his face as he stays hunched over the fallen monster, finishing the fight for good. Standing over the beast, the kid thanks Torque for the help. Covered in blood, he walks up to Torque, who's tending to an unconscious first year named Eld, and admits he'd have been in serious trouble without Torque's magic. Torque, for his part, confesses that despite acting all confident, that fight was way tougher than he expected. The kid's visibly moved, realizing Torque just used his actual name for the first time in all this chaos. Torque thinks back on how he'd spontaneously called the kid a member of their class, feeling a little proud of himself, while wondering if the kid was actually thinking about that stuff in the middle of a life-or-death fight. Trying to hide his embarrassment, Torque claims he just guessed the name, though he privately admits the kid's on a whole different level, kind of like Wallace. The kid clarifies that his name is Allmark, which sends Torque into a sudden fit of laughter while Allmark just smiles back. Turning to check on Eld, Torque confirms there's no visible wounds, but Eld still won't wake up despite Allmark's frantic attempts to stir him. They go back and forth on whether the monster was poisonous, but Torque's pretty sure it wasn't, which just leaves them confused about why Eld's still out. A sudden burst of magic and a strong gust of wind catches both of them off guard, and they both turn toward the trees. Professor Ilmes shows up and immediately checks on them, and Allmark clarifies that all the blood on him is just backlash from the monster, not his own. After looking Eld over, the professor explains he's fine, just completely drained his magic. Ilmes reveals that a girl named Shiri told him how Eld protected her, casting a mist spell the second those monsters showed up in the field. Torque figured it was just Eld putting on a tough act, but the professor explains he actually risked his life for Shiri, which says a lot about why he's known as a genius. Allmark thinks back on his own skills and knowledge, wondering if he'd have made that same selfless choice if he'd been in Eld's shoes. While Torque jokes that the professor's got them covered now, Allmark's still lost in thought, wondering if he's really capable of risking everything to save a classmate. Torque tells him he's lucky to have a first year that's solid looking out for them, and Allmark agrees there's still plenty to learn from the guy. When the professor asks who's responsible for all this, Torque gives Allmark most of the credit, though Allmark insists they only made it this far thanks to Torque's magic during the fight. The professor admits they both pulled their weight, but says he never expected two monsters to show up in a forest where they usually only appear once in a blue moon. He mentions the deeper investigation into the forest is a job for teachers and older students, and turns down Torque's request to tag along, despite how strange it is for monsters to show up this shallow. A girl rushes over, worried someone's hurt, but Allmark clears it up. The blood's not his, it's the monster's. She's relieved and suggests they all head back. As the group gets ready to move, Allmark takes a drink from a bottle while someone starts wiping the blood off his face. Torque tells Allmark to walk behind him, but Allmark points out Torque's the one who'd been running ahead the whole time anyway. Torque gets a little annoyed and tells him to just walk in front instead. Allmark shrugs and agrees while Torque storms off with an irritated tusk. A girl thinks back on a shadow she missed spotting earlier and tells herself she needs to be more careful, no more slipping up like that. Watching the wind pick up, she wonders if it's a storm rolling in from the north, or if the whirlpool of death is starting to creep toward Nork Academy. From somewhere deep in the woods, a voice calls out to Allmark. Wendy and Muzin come running toward the group, calling out for Torque as they arrive. Torque's glad to see everyone's okay and gets praised by the boys for being cool and helpful, though he brushes the compliments off like it's nothing. Wendy notices blood on Allmark's face and starts to panic until he explains it's not his own, which brings her a wave of relief, even though she's still pretty surprised. Muzin tearfully apologizes to Allmark, blaming himself for not telling a teacher about the shadow he saw, but Allmark insists that's actually what saved him. Allmark explains that knowing the monster was a Jalanan let him plan his whole strategy, and gives credit to Shira's description of the claws and fur for making it possible. Muzin admits he just didn't have the courage to follow them into the forest, and Wendy adds that chasing after them with his current power would've just made him a liability. Even with all that, Allmark tells him it actually would've helped a lot more if he'd come along. Admitting it's embarrassing, Allmark tells Muzin he thought he could handle it solo, but honestly he'd have felt a lot more confident with Muzin there. Allmark promises he'll count on Muzin next time something happens, and Muzin excitedly vows to help however he can. Wendy chimes in too, telling Muzin Shed have felt way stronger if Shed been there, which gets everyone wondering if they ran into Wallace out in the forest. Once the group confirms nobody saw him, Wallace suddenly steps out from the trees, explaining he tried to catch up after hearing Muzin's story, but the forest was just too huge to navigate. Wallace admits he failed to act despite all his earlier big talk, insists the credit for keeping the first years safe belongs entirely to Allmark, and then gets invited to walk back to the academy with the rest of them. As Wallace walks off, Allmark keeps his suspicions to himself, not mentioning to Wendy that Wallace was clearly lying about struggling out there since the smell of blood is still clinging to him. Allmark watches him disappear in silence, wondering what Wallace's real motive was for that lie, an uneasy feeling settling over the whole thing. Muzin lightens the mood, announcing he's going to start collecting and sharing every rumor he hears, convinced even the smallest scrap of info could end up useful someday. Everyone agrees as they head back to the dorms, the conversation drifting toward how exhausted and hungry they all are after the day they've had. The school bell rings out across the grounds, and Allmark stretches after his long day just as Wendy walks up to him. Wendy mentions she's heading back into the forest to gather herbs for tomorrow's class and invites Allmark along, since it's been a while since students were even allowed in there. Allmark wants to go but has to turn her down because of an upcoming meditation session with Professor Ilmes, so Wendy decides she'll just make do with her leftover herb supply instead. The forest had recently been the site of a crisis, a student getting snatched by a monster called Jaranan, which led to a strict lockdown and forced the healing arts teacher, Ms. Syria, to hand out herbs from her own garden instead. Once the ban lifted, students were warned not to wander too deep in, while Eld, the victim, recovered from his magical exhaustion and got back to his usual routine. Allmark and Torque became the hot topic around the academy for their part in the rescue, but since neither of them offered up any dramatic details, everyone's interest fizzled out pretty fast. Allmark stayed quietly unsettled by just how hard that monster had been to take down, while Torque refused to admit they'd worked together and threatened to shut down anyone who kept spreading the story. Once the monster talk died down, Muzin brought up something new, a statue of some guy he called Lord Borak, though Allmark could barely remember the name right. Muzin explained the statue was tucked deep inside the academy's carefully kept hedge maze, standing at the very center like some kind of scholar frozen in stone. Allmark eventually corrected the name to Lord Valak, remembering the garden was actually a leftover piece of an old manor from Nork Island, donated to King Galai. After shutting his book to make sure nobody else was listening, Muzin leaned in and whispered a local legend that the statue of Lord Valak supposedly talks once night falls. Allmark just reacted with mild curiosity instead of fear, which honestly frustrated Muzin, who was hopping for a much more terrified response to his ghost story. When the rest of the group showed up wondering what all the fuss was about, Muzin got ready to tell the legend to everyone, grumbling that Allmark was no fun to scare. Allmark listens as Muzin describes some deserted garden at midnight, where a mysterious voice calls out his name from deep inside a maze. The story keeps going, someone wandering through the dark only to find that silent statue of Lord Valak standing there, and the other students can't help but comment on how vivid it all sounds. Nelson asks if this actually happened to him, but Muzin clarifies he heard it from someone in Class 1, and honestly he wouldn't have the nerve to go check it out himself. Hooked on the story, Nelson suggests they all go visit the statue tonight, but everyone else immediately shuts that idea down. Wait, way too creepy. Nelson tries to talk Allmark into joining him, but Allmark passes, wanting to focus on his meditation training, so Nelson decides he'll just track down the voice on his own. Despite everyone warning him to be careful, Nelson insists the garden's safe since guards patrol it regularly, and tells the group he's definitely going tonight. Muzin starts retelling the same legend to Wallace, while Nelson tries and fails to recruit him for the late-night trip. Wallace compliments Muzin's storytelling but passes on the invite, figuring there's not much to gain from getting involved. After Wallace gives him a parting warning, Nelson stays firm on going anyway, and the others just tell him to be careful. The next morning, Allmark spots Nelson in the dining hall looking pale and worn out from his night in the garden. Nelson confirms everything happened exactly like the legend said. He heard the voice from the maze and it kept him up all night. Nelson claims he was just too curious to sleep, not scared, and later Allmark brings up the strange story with Wendy. Wendy admits she's actually interested now that the rumors seem to check out and asks Allmark if he'll go with her tonight. She points out that his martial arts skills probably won't do much against a ghost, poking a little fun at his current struggles with magic. Wendy tells him he'll become a great magician eventually, adding that her own stubborn will is what's helping her master her magic. That night, Allmark and Wendy meet up with Nelson, and they light a magic lamp to get ready for their investigation. The three of them walk toward the maze under the moonlight, pointing out they're leaving at the exact same time Nelson did the night before. Passing the garden lamps, Wendy notes that the bright light just makes the shadows around them feel even darker and more ominous. Nelson tells Wendy to walk between the two of them for safety as he points out the maze entrance, and Allmark can't help but wonder why Nelson's acting so brave all of a sudden. At the entrance, Nelson notes they haven't heard anything yet today, while Allmark quietly reflects on his own impulsive decision to come along. The three of them debate whether to wait or head in after hearing that strange noise the day before, but they quickly duck out of sight when a lantern light comes into view. They hold their breath behind a hedge as a guard with a lantern walks past, only relaxing once the coast is clear. They talk over the risk of getting caught, agreeing that a report to Mayeson would mean a whole chain of lectures from teachers and dorm staff. One of them explains the guard they just saw was Jeedson, known for being understanding, and Allmark remembers Jeed helping him out on his very first day at the academy. They all agree Jeedson's a good guy who usually just gives a warning on the spot, and they keep walking deeper into the grounds. Allmark realizes he hasn't seen Jeedson since his first day of classes and figures he should stop by the gate to say hi sometime soon. The mysterious sound returns from inside the maze, same as yesterday, and Allmark stops in his tracks like he's picked up on something off. Allmark points out that a wind suddenly kicked up that wasn't there a second ago. Nelson leads the way into the dark maze, following the sound, which is now close enough for all of them to hear clearly. Nelson reveals he's got the whole layout memorized, since he used to play hide and seek in these corridors every day back in his first year. While Wendy admires the craftsmanship of the hedges, Allmark's distracted by a faint wind that's been blowing ever since they walked in. They're getting close now, the voice growing louder, and Nelson tells them to turn left toward the plaza. They reach a statue in the plaza, but the voice starts to fade out, and Allmark figures whatever's happening is somehow tied to the wind. Noticing how the air currents scatter in the open space, Allmark tells Wendy and Nelson to try pulling the wind back together. He asks his friends to use a wind-bending technique to draw in the air flowing out of the square, even though Nelson's not sure he can pull it off. As Wendy and Nelson focus their magic, the wind starts blowing back toward them, and the voice becomes clear again. The voice comes through perfectly now, complaining about being hungry and heading back to the dorm, and it turns out the source is a girl named Nourish. Nourish is mortified realizing her private ramblings got overheard, and she immediately turns it around on the group, demanding to know why they were even listening. Wendy's impressed Nourish can already pull off the wind-borne message spell, something usually taught to older students, but Nourish admits her control is still shaky. Nourish explains how tricky it is to send a message through the wind to a specific spot, and Allmark can't figure out why Shed bother with such a complicated spell just to ramble. A heated argument breaks out as Allmark snaps that he doesn't want to be judged by someone like her, brushing off her chatter as completely pointless. The group presses her on why Shed send a wind-borne message specifically to Lord Volok's statue, but she stubbornly insists there's no deeper reason behind it, despite Allmark clearly not buying it. Allmark points out her voice sounded unusually soft and warm, like she was talking to her own grandfather, which makes her freeze up in shock. When Nelson asks if if she's the legendary figure's granddaughter, she gets defensive and calls him an idiot, while the others just marvel at how Allmark seems to see right through everything. Looking for somewhere more private, Nourish suggests they move to the garden, so the whole group heads outside together. As they walk, she opens up about being a crybaby her first year, which got her bullied constantly, and how she tried hiding her frustration from her roommate Lilte. She explains she started wandering into the maze on a whim, hoping to find somewhere to cry alone where nobody would ever notice her. Even though the area was usually used by boys messing around, she eventually stumbled onto something incredible during one of those private visits. She reveals the statue in the maze looks exactly like her beloved grandfather, who passed away right before she officially enrolled at the academy. Looking for comfort, she'd visit the statue whenever something went wrong and eventually started using it as a target for practicing her Windborn message spell, just to feel like she was still talking to him. Wendy realizes this explains the mysterious voice they'd been hearing, and Nourish admits she sends the messages from her window every evening after dinner. Allmark lays out the logic, how the sloping terrain and hedges funnel the wind messages right into the central plaza, accidentally kicking off a whole ghost story. Nelson's irritated the whole mystery turns out to be nothing but magic practice, but he still gets defensive once the conversation shifts to her talking to her grandfather. While the girls are eager to hear more of her story, Nelson dismisses the whole thing as a waste of time and pushes for the group to head back. Wendy notices Nelson's light magic flickering, a sign he's genuinely angry on Nourish's behalf after hearing about the bullying she went through. Picking up on this as Nelson's clumsy way of showing he cares, Nourish remembers a moment from years ago when he approached her in the maze to invite her to play hide and seek. She'd been caught off guard and turned him down back then, but the gesture made her happy, and now she figures she should try talking to Nelson more often. Nelson insists on heading home alone first, telling Allmark to walk the girls back properly, and the rest of the group agrees to leave the garden together. Looking out from the academy grounds, the students talk about the upcoming 2-month summer break and how everyone's parents will soon be showing up to pick them up. Thinking back on the months since he started at the academy, Allmark feels a nagging sense of uncertainty watching his classmates get better at practical magic while all he's allowed to do is meditate. While Allmark's lost in thought watching other students pull off advanced magic, Muzin interrupts to ask if he's even listening, then asks what his plans are for summer break. Allmark explains that since he can't head back north for another year and has no way to reach his father anyway, he doesn't have much choice but to stay at the academy. Hearing Allmark's stuck doing daily meditation training, Muzin's relieved, admitting he was worried about being alone over break, but reveals he can't afford to travel home to the Galai Kingdom either. As the son of a woodcutter, Muzin relies on a government pension that used to cover visits home, but with his little sister born this year, he's got to save every penny for her food and care instead. Wendy joins in, sharing that she's heading to the royal capital on the very first day of break to see her parents. Wendy explains her father now works as a minister in the capital, while a magistrate runs their actual territory, and the group figures Wallace is probably heading to the far western edge of the kingdom too. Allmark recalls seeing the Mosville estate on a map once, remembering just how remote it is out on the frontier, which makes Muzin realize the two of them are the only ones sticking around the dorms. Wanting to help her friends out, Wendy suddenly offers to have both Allmark and Muzin come stay at her place in Garunther, just a 2-day trip away. Muzin's instantly thrilled, but Allmark hesitates, caught up in his meditation schedule and the pressure he's been feeling about still not being able to use magic. Muzin begs Allmark to come along so he won't be the only guest, and Allmark finally agrees, though he suggests keeping it to a shorter 5-day visit so he's not overstaying his welcome. The three of them get excited planning out the best summer vacation ever, with no clue that a rough round of exams is standing between them and that trip. The upcoming written and practical exams are no joke. Bad scores could mean mandatory remedial classes over break or even hold a student back a year. Watching Layla off in the distance, Muzin tries to reassure Allmark that magic's really just about willpower, though Allmark points out Muzin's own low scores last year make him the one most at risk of ending up in summer school. Muzin insists he's never actually failed a subject, and seeing Allmark struggle with his first real round of exam prep, Wendy steps up to help. Wendy starts spending her free time in the library tutoring Allmark, insisting it helps her own studying too, and telling him to just say something if her being there ever becomes a distraction. Allmark feels indebted since all he's really got to offer in return are some trivial travel stories, and Wendy starts to notice his growing distraction. Later, during a meeting, Professor Ilmes immediately picks up on the fact that Allmark's troubled and correctly guesses his lack of focus has something to do with his feelings for Wendy. Allmark admits he wants to repay Wendy's kindness somehow but keeps feeling a strange ache in his chest whenever he thinks about it. The professor suggests that might just mean he likes her, a concept that leaves Allmark genuinely confused. The professor tells him not to fear these new feelings but to treat them like a conversation with himself, kind of like how he approaches learning magic. Pointing to Allmark's chest, the professor tells him to hold onto this particular feeling and remember it well, since understanding emotions like this matters a lot for his future as a magician. The conversation turns to Wendy's genuine desire to help, with the professor asking if Allmark would feel burdened receiving that kind of support, which makes him realize he'd gladly do the same for her without a second thought. Admitting personal advice isn't really his thing, the professor steers things back to magic, stressing that a real magician has to learn to keep negative emotions separate from their craft, no matter their mental state. Shifting into a history lecture, the professor explains that the world as it stands today was shaped mainly by two specific entities among the 8 inner pillars. As he asks the class to name those 2 pillars, Allmark finds himself struggling with the Academy's dense world theories, even though he's gotten used to most of the other lessons by now. The lesson covers the hierarchy, the Great Four, the 8 inner pillars who created the world, and the 16 lesser pillars, and Allmark notices the northern gods from back home aren't mentioned anywhere in this history. Students name the hero god Hardika and the guiding beacon Luhanik. Then the teacher asks Torque to name the creators of land and sea, Ekrunder and Sumasinef. After Torque names Izumagu and Almedas, the teacher turns to Lilte, who correctly names Volska and Krusfolk, before the discussion shifts to a nameless entity among the lesser pillars. Layla confirms that the god of darkness has no name for reasons nobody really knows, and the teacher asks Wendy if she can give this deity a title. Wendy names it the Lord of the Dark Abyss, a phrase that strikes a strange chord of familiarity with Allmark right before the teacher wraps up class with a warning about the exams coming up. After class, the boys vent about studying in the heat, joking that it'd already be full summer if they were up north. Someone suggests skipping the studying for a day to hang out in the forest, but Allmark hesitates, feeling the pressure of his first exam and dreading the idea of remedial lessons with Professor Ilmes. The group acknowledges just how rough Allmark's position is, catching up on 2 years of curriculum in only a few months, though Wendy insists helping him isn't anything special. Morgan suddenly bails on the plan to play, realizing he can't risk failing and getting stuck in remedial classes, which catches his friends off guard. Feeling the gap between himself and Wallace, the frustrated student is caught off guard when Wallace just asks why he doesn't head to the forest if that's really what he wants. Wallace encourages him to go learn from nature since everyone else will be cooped up studying anyway, leaving the guy confused by such unexpected support. Despite the offer, he decides to stick with studying until exams are over, while Wallace tells the rest of them they're free to do whatever, as long as they can handle whatever consequences come with it. As Wallace walks off, he warns Allmark that his choices are going to stir up trouble, telling him to brace for the results, which only makes Allmark more determined than ever. The group's resolve locks in, everyone vowing to grind through their studies to dodge remedial classes and land high scores on the upcoming tests. The first day of testing arrives, packed with written exams covering everything from world history to magical theory to botany. Grinding through the tough section on the origin of humanity, Allmark pushes himself for Wendy's sake as the schedule moves toward day 2 of practical exams. Allmark finishes his practical tests in martial arts and medicine and gets compared by an instructor to a wild wolf pretending to be a house pet before getting dismissed. On day 3, oral exams, Allmark answers a string of questions about the history and territories of the Galai Kingdom fast and dead accurate. A woman announces the start of the final magic practical and tells everyone to head straight back to their dorms once they're done, no leaks allowed. While the students wait, Nelson's clearly anxious, and a girl encourages Allmark to trust in how far he's come. Allmark reflects on all his meditation while Torque teamwork teases his nerves, doubting whether he's actually got anything to show for it. In his own head, Allmark wrestles with his fear of failing and his resolve not to disappoint Wendy or end up stuck in remedial classes. Deg, a top student known for his levitation magic, unexpectedly admits he's actually jealous of Allmark. When it's Deg's turn to head into the exam, he mentions their teacher's philosophy that what's visible isn't really what matters, which leaves Allmark completely confused. Deg tells Allmark that everyone, including Layla and Wallace, envies him, and Allmark can't help but wonder if that's some kind of hint for the test ahead. Standing alone, Allmark decides he's going to face whatever's coming head-on, no giving up before it even starts. Allmark walks in to meet Professor Ilmes, who sets a stone down on the floor and tells him to show off what all his trainings amounted to. Stuck without any specific instructions, Allmark's not sure what to do with the stone, comparing himself to Deg, who'd probably just make it float without thinking twice. He thinks back on everyone's different specialties, Wendy's transformations, Wallace's patterns, trying to figure out some kind of path forward. Allmark remembers Torque teaching him stone-carving magic and decides to draw on the focus from his meditation to attempt the spell for the professor. As he gets ready to cast, Allmark pictures the magic in his head but gets nervous thinking about wanting to repay Wendy. His focus wavers until he remembers his friends cheering him on, and that steadies him back down. Allmark realizes the real result of all his lessons is the meditation itself, and decides to show the professor his ability by focusing purely on his internal state. He slips into deep meditation, feeling his inner magic reach a new level of clarity until the professor calls time on the test. Allmark admits he lost his composure for a second there, while Professor Ilmes reveals he was actually curious from the start about the kid's unconventional approach during the exam. The professor explains the test was meant to show off what they'd learned in class, not a gamble on brand new skills, and warns Allmark to stay grateful to his friends as he keeps growing. The teacher praises Allmark for how far his meditations come, saying the hard work's clearly paying off, and promises to start teaching him actual magic once the break's over. Lying in bed, Allmark thinks about the long road ahead of becoming a mage like his father, right before a friend knocks on his door, telling him they need to hurry to the garden before something starts. The boys rush down the stairs in a panic, realizing they're late and the rest of their class already left for the gathering. They run outside to catch up, bickering over whose fault it was that Allmark overslept before their friends finally greet them, teasing them for showing up last. Allmark takes a second to thank Wendy for helping him through the exam, but she brushes it off, insisting his success came entirely from his own effort. While Muzin wonders what's about to happen, Wendy keeps it a secret, telling Allmark to look up at the sky because the show's starting. Bright bursts of magic light up the night sky, and Allmark and Wendy stand there staring up in total awe at the whole spectacle. These magic fireworks are the grand finale for exam season, held every year for both the middle and high divisions right up until this final night. Wendy explains it's tradition for the senior students to launch these displays to celebrate the end of testing, and Allmark's left speechless by just how powerful and beautiful magic can be. Watching his happy classmates, Allmark wonders if he'll ever be able to cast magic that makes people smile like that, and Wendy invites everyone to join the celebration together. The group decides to party the whole night through to reward themselves for all the hard work, even with some of them still nervous about how they actually did. Allmark checks his results and sees he landed 25th out of 46 students, enough to dodge remedial classes and finally head to the mansion without any lingering worries. The day before break starts, Allmark asks Muzin why he's making the rounds to everyone's rooms since they're all parting ways tomorrow, and they agree it's the right time for goodbyes. They find their friends busy packing souvenirs for break, and Norish mentions her dad's coming to pick her up. After Allmark suggests Lilte ask her parents for a new handkerchief, the boys say their goodbyes and head off to Wendy's room next. Wendy tells them her butler's arriving soon to take her home, and promises to write Allmark a letter letting him know the best day to visit. Muzin gets way too excited about seeing a noble mansion, but Wendy's roommate Kala shuts that down fast, explaining her family's just simple countryside nobles. After Muzin clears out, Allmark lingers a moment to tell Wendy he's planning to leave school before noon tomorrow. Wendy hesitates before asking if he'd come see her off since they won't be able to meet for a while, and she lights up when he immediately says yes. They say goodnight, promising to meet up tomorrow, until Muzin interrupts to drag Allmark off to their next friend's room. The next morning, out on a walk, Allmark thinks about how everyone else seemed to genuinely enjoy the fireworks after exam exams, while he felt kind of distant from all that right before something catches his attention nearby. He runs into Layla, who's getting ready to leave since her family's waiting at the port, and they trade a quick goodbye before she heads off. Watching her go, he thinks about the complicated political standing of the Cowgan house back in the Lagotia kingdom, remembering how she once mentioned not having much time. Back at the building, he watches through a window as Eld gets lectured while still helping others out, and Allmark's glad he could actually be useful this time. He stares out the window, thinking that if his father ever showed up to get him, it'd be too late to regret skipping his armor. He remembers his father's whole philosophy of never letting his guard down, even as a mercenary, and wonders if his dad still wears that armor after 6 years before he notices Wendy's nowhere to be found. He asks Torque if he's heading back too, nodding he doesn't look too happy about it while wondering if Wendy's still in her room. Torque gripes about the reality of going home to his siblings and warns Allmark to keep up his meditation and magic lessons, no slacking off. Checking the shared room, Allmark learns from another student that Wendy already took her key and left earlier that morning, and nobody's seen her since. Allmark runs into an older man out looking for Wendy and confirms that he's one of her classmates. He introduces himself as Allmark to the butler, Ward, who's out searching for Lady Wendy, and the two of them debate whether to check the school or the forest. Allmark insists on checking both spots himself just to be safe, telling the group to wait there while he runs off. He eventually finds Wendy out in the forest and lets her know Ward's looking for her before they hurry back together. They reunite with Ward and Lisa, and the butler bows deeply to thank Allmark for thinking fast, despite Allmark protesting he's just a commoner. Ward explains the academy doesn't distinguish between nobles and commoners, and that Lord Elmond instructed them to treat every student with respect before they head toward the room together. Allmark mentions his plan to invite Muzin over the summer, and Ward encourages him to come visit the family too. While Ward talks about how much joy Wendy's smile brings to the whole Burherb family, Allmark asks her why she'd gone into the forest alone. Wendy explains she went to check on a swamp rose mallow bud that only blooms in midsummer, but it hadn't opened yet. At the gate, Wendy promises to write during the break, and Allmark tells her he'll be waiting for that letter. Ward announces it's finally time to go, and Allmark watches the group walk off after their last goodbyes. As the term wraps up, Allmark's classmates remind him about unfinished textbooks, offering to review together and hand him a practice wand for his training. Allmark catches up with Wendy to give her his sincere thanks, telling her he's only made it this far at the academy because of the constant help she's given him since day one. Shouting one last word of gratitude, he heads toward the exit while Wendy watches him go from a distance. Allmark waves one last time to his friend as she stands there alone, smiling back at him before turning to go her own way. Wendy's greeted by her waiting family and staff, and Allmark watches the reunion from the sidelines. Allmark walks up to a guard named Jeed and strikes up a conversation, mentioning it's been a while since they last talked. Jeed comments on how tough departure day always is for the guards, but Allmark explains he's not actually heading home, since he'd already braced himself for a long stay back when he first arrived. Having spent a year and a half traveling alone just to reach the academy, Allmark feels no urge to head back home after only a few months and asks if Layla was the first student to leave. The guard confirms Layla left earlier that day and mentions another student, Wallace, also left alone the night before, which is apparently just his usual routine. They talk about how Wallace travels solo from the western edge of Galai despite being a noble's son, which reminds Allmark of his own childhood on the battlefield and only deepens the mystery of why nobody ever shows up to pick him up. Allmark tells Jeed he's fully settled into his new life now, even though he still can't use magic, and shares how excited he is to visit Wendy's estate with Muzin over the break. Jeed notices Allmark's expression has softened a lot compared to when they first met, right before the scene jumps ahead a few days. Muzin's in a full state of despair, declaring his break's already over, just as a new letter shows up at the door. 12 days into break, Allmark reads an apology letter and realizes things have changed, making it impossible for him and Muzin to visit the estate like they planned. Somewhere else, a group of armed men waits outside a large building under cover of night as their leader signals it's time to move. Out fishing, Allmark tries to cheer Muzin up, acknowledging the news from the day before's been rough to swallow. The letter explained that Wendy's father, Lord Elmond, is a high-ranking minister with plenty of political enemies, and suspicious figures have recently been spotted lurking around the family estate. Threatening letters and ugly warnings had been showing up at the household, and while Lord Elmond's usually unshakable, he acted fast to separate Wendy from her parents for her own safety the moment she arrived. Despite her pleas to visit her friends, Wendy got sent off to a secure villa in the northern Burherb territory under guard, leaving her to write a letter full of regret and apology. Back at the river, Muzin keeps sulking over the cancelled plans while Allmark remembers having to practically drag his friend out of the house just to get him fishing in the first place. Looking at the blooming swamp rose mallow flowers, Allmark feels a heavy sadness settle in despite how beautiful they are. Muzin asks what he just said, and Allmark just points toward the spot where the flowers are blooming. They walk closer to the patch, and Allmark confirms, yeah, it really is beautiful. The two of them talk about how these flowers also grow back on Nork Island, realizing this is actually their first time seeing them during a southern summer. Thinking about Wendy, Allmark decides they should go show her the flowers, and the two of them set off right away. Back in Allmark's room, they study a map of the Galai Kingdom, planning out a 4-day trip to Miletus using the King's Road white carriage. Muzin's shocked at how much that could cost 2 kids, but Allmark's already considering camping out to save money, even though it seems pretty unrealistic for their age. The King's Road runs on advanced magical metal horses that cut travel time in half, but the price tag makes it a luxury only the wealthy can really afford. Allmark decides to try a specific trick to solve their money problem, leading a confused Muzin toward the school building to make a bold move. Standing in front of the headmaster, Muzin's already regretting following Allmark into whatever this is. To his friend's total shock, Allmark just asks the headmaster outright for money to travel to Miletus. The headmaster acknowledges he'd offered to help before, but asks why Allmark's suddenly requesting such a big amount. Allmark explains he wants to visit a lonely friend and show her the flowers from Nork Island, admitting he needs the safest travel option even though he's flat broke. Sensing he's being honest, the headmaster agrees to front the money, as long as Allmark comes straight back to school with no detours. After the boys thank him and head out, the headmaster sits alone for a moment, reflecting on the whole exchange. Looking out from his office, he notes that the stars seem destined to move this way and braces himself for whatever's coming. The boys are stunned to walk away with such a huge sum of coins, and Allmark carefully calculates the costs for their first ride in a white carriage. With everything nearly ready, they gather their money and head into town to shop for the trip. Somewhere else, a man reports to a seated figure about the current situation with Lord Elmond's daughter. Hearing she's in Miletus, the Lord orders his men to wait a few days for the guards to let their guard down before making a move. The long journey finally reaches its destination as the travelers set foot on solid ground. They arrive at Rilpda Port, a place that sparks a wave of nostalgia in one of them. One of them explains he had to work a whole month to save up for the ship fare since he only earns a fraction of an adult's wage. After that, they buy 2 tickets to Garunther and get ready to board. Riding in the carriage, the younger one's amazed at how fast they're moving and finds out they're set to arrive in Garunther by noon the next day. The driver warns him not to get ahead of himself, explaining the city's massive and packed with all kinds of people, just as another carriage passes them on the road. To avoid getting stuck behind other travelers at the station, the driver decides to pick up the pace and tells his passengers to hang on tight. The carriage races forward at a reckless speed, forcing one of them to grab the other and warn him that falling off would be deadly, while the driver just keeps laughing wildly. After finishing the trip in second place and wrapping up the paperwork, the driver says his goodbyes, hoping to see them again, leaving the two of them to figure out their next move toward the white carriage area. Muzin gets sidetracked by all the delicious street food and starts buying snacks left and right, making Allmark wonder if he can actually finish all that before they even board. Reaching the white carriage waiting area, the boys feel completely out of place surrounded by wealthy, noble-looking passengers, but they still approach the staff to ask about the route to Miletus. The receptionist tells them the carriage to Miletus already left, suggesting they come back the next morning, so the two decide to stay at an inn instead of risking the dangerous streets at night. Agreeing that camping outside is too risky, they manage to snag the last available room on the second floor of a nearby inn, where they're told dinner's served served in the attached tavern. Finding the room cheaper than they expected, they drop off their bags and head down for an early dinner while the tavern's still quiet, even though one of them already ate a mountain of snacks earlier. They grab a corner table in the tavern and notice the place is already filling up, realizing it's only going to get more chaotic as the night goes on. A waitress brings their soup and collects payment while a group of stern-looking men takes a seat nearby. Allmark catches a familiar scent and immediately clocks the man at the next table as a mercenary who's seen real combat up north. He notices these guys still carry that unmistakable soldier's aura, while Muzin's completely absorbed in enjoying his meal. A sudden lull in the room has Allmark fixated on the group of men, and Muzin asks why he's making such a terrifying face all of a sudden. Allmark overhears one of the mercenaries mention the name Burher, which he recognizes instantly as Wendy's family name, and it hits him right away that their presence spells trouble for her. He quietly asks Muzin to listen in on their conversation, explaining that since they dropped Wendy's family name and carry all the traits of northern mercenaries, they're a serious threat worth watching closely. As they eat, the men start talking about southern conflicts where mercenaries handle smaller jobs, even assassinations, which lines up exactly with what Wendy mentioned in her letter. Allmark suspects these guys were hired by political enemies to lurk around the mansion, and asks Muzin to use his voice hunting technique to eavesdrop despite Muzin's shaky confidence with wind magic. With Wendy's safety on the line and Allmark still unable to use magic himself, Muzin nervously agrees to help for her sake. Muzin starts casting but locks onto the wrong table at first until Allmark redirects him to the right group. Straining to catch the distant conversation, the two of them start picking up faint fragments about help and requests concerning Wendy. The eavesdropping sharpens up as they catch the men discussing a 3-day timeline and waiting for a specific movement, confirming Allmark's worst fears about Wendy. After a waitress briefly interrupts to clear the table, the boys are left reeling from what they just heard. The mercenaries plan to finish the job by killing Wendy. Back in their room, they map out the threat from the tavern mercenaries, agreeing they can't forgive men who treat murder like it's just another job. They realize they've got to save her, but they're up against a mansion behind heavily guarded walls where nobody's going to believe a couple of kids. Allmark figures a child's warning would probably get ignored, and any messenger would show up too late, so their only real option is to stick to the plan and head straight to Miletus. They decide to tell a man named Ward once they get there, hopping to shore up the estate's defenses before the white carriage picks them up the next morning. The white carriage shows up right on time, proof of just how disciplined the Northern Reserve soldiers are, and the boys get ready for the ride. While Muzin settles into the luxury of the carriage, Allmark stays tense and focused, anxious to reach their destination as fast as possible. Muzin shares his simple philosophy of not stressing over problems he can't solve, but their talk gets cut off by a sudden outburst from another passenger. They spot a young lady arguing with her frazzled servant over some forgotten item, the man groaning about how hard it is to travel with a highborn kid. The whole commotion's over a missing stuffed animal named Miasha, which the servant accidentally left behind, mistaking it for a bundle of scrap fabric. Allmark takes an interest in the discarded cloth, and the servant offers to hand over the scraps since they're not needed anymore. As Muzin starts fiddling with the fabric, the servant mentions he knows how to handle kids since he's got a sister of his own. Muzin notices Allmark's acting a little off compared to usual, normally the first one to jump in and help, but now completely wrapped up in worry over everything they've heard. Allmark's impressed to see Muzin skillfully shape the fabric into a little bear and asks for a pen to finish the job. Muzin hands over the little handmade gift, explaining he used to make things like this for his sister, offering it up as a travel companion for the girl's trip ahead. While Muzin suggests a simple name, Allmark and the girl push for something more unique, and she ends up naming the bear Will, declaring him her new little brother. Muria happily introduces herself and her new companion, and the group settles in to talk as the journey continues. When the man in the carriage asks who they are, Allmark flatly refuses to give his name. Even with an invitation to travel further to Rinovs, Allmark explains he can't stay, leaving the bear behind as his stand-in to comfort a tearful Muria, who says how much she loves the gift. Allmark reflects that since their arrival time in Miletus is already set, they might as well just focus on enjoying the present instead of worrying. Muzan agrees, figuring they'll deal with scary stuff only when it actually shows up, and the servant smiles at how determined they are to just enjoy themselves. Planning for their stop in Bora, Allmark suggests they get a room to clean up first, since he doesn't want to show up anywhere smelling like the road. The boys look forward to seeing Wendy again, swapping stories over a good meal. Hopping the souvenirs from their trip will cheer her up as the carriage rolls through the countryside. The journey finally leads them to Miletus, a bustling town full of stone paths, fountains, and sprawling architecture. At a grand estate in town, a quiet moment begins as a heavy book gets opened in silence. 9 days have passed since the girl arrived at the Miletus estate, and she's frustrated at not being allowed outside during her own summer break. An elder named Ward explains her life's being targeted, which makes leaving the estate completely off the table, and it hits her that she can't invite Allmark and Muzan over anymore. She begs her father for just a little more time at Garunther, but he stays firm on saying no, while her mother watches the whole exchange in silence. Seeing her mother worn down by the constant harassment, she accepts the situation, but can't help wondering if her apology letters ever even made it to her friends. She remembers Muzan's pure excitement when he first got invited to the estate, and feels a deep pang of guilt over the disappointment he must be feeling now. Her thoughts drift to Allmark, the mysterious boy from the north, and she decides she'll write him another letter once things settle down. She admits to herself she ignored Allmark's preference for training just because she selfishly wanted him to see her home and meet her family. Remembering how she nudged his feelings to get him to agree, she now sees her isolation as a fair punishment for putting him through that. She worries Allmark might not have reacted to her letter at all, which would mean she doesn't matter much to him, and she feels the full weight of guilt for how she treated both her friends. Standing by the window, Wendy regrets her earlier invitation while noticing shadows outside that remind her of Allmark and Muzan. She brushes off the thought as impossible, given the distance from Nork Island, just as loud footsteps approach and Ward calls out for her. Wendy stays seated by the window as Ward's shouting grows louder and more insistent. Ward bursts into the room, announcing that Allmark and Muzan have arrived, and she's left completely stunned. Overwhelmed with tears, she insists it has to be a dream, since the trip should have taken at least 4 days even with the fastest horse. Hit with a wave of guilt over how she'd been feeling, she rushes down the stairs and stops right at the door where she hears their familiar voices. Seeing they're actually there, Wendy watches the two boys wave and greet her warmly. She throws herself into a tearful hug as they explain they read her letter and just decided to come see her anyway, distance be damned. As they head inside, the boys dig into some food while Wendy tries to hide her still emotional face. Muzan can't stop raving about how good the food looks and smells, while Wendy keeps offering up more dishes to her hungry guests. The boys playfully argue over their eating habits while Wendy just soaks in how happy she is they're here. Despite the formal setting, Muzan's easy manners bring a smile to Wendy and the staff, all of them glad to see her actually having fun. Allmark thinks about how naturally Muzan puts people at ease, wondering if he's even tasting the complex flavors of the meal or just shoveling it in. Allmark explains how growing up around mercenaries shaped his whole view on food, right before Muzan launches into a story for Wendy about how they talk the headmaster into a carriage. The group shares a laugh over the whole journey, while the butler offers to send someone to fetch Allmark's bag. Allmark digs through his luggage and hands Wendy a book, telling her to open it up and take a look. Flipping through the pages, Wendy finds a carefully pressed flower used as a bookmark, and for a second she's completely stunned. Allmark explains he found the bloom on Nork Island and was determined to show it to her, while Muzan fills in the chaotic details of their sudden departure. Wendy looks at the flower and realizes it's exactly the symbol of the summer vacation she thought she'd lost. Filled with gratitude and joy, Wendy thanks her friends for making her cry with happiness all over again. After the meal wraps up, the scene shifts back to a meeting earlier that day, where an older man's shocked to learn an attack could hit within the next few days, and he asks about the current guard count. The man explains they've got 20 guards assigned specifically to protect the young lady, but Allmark warns that won't be nearly enough since the enemy likely has around 10 people hiding around town. Worried that reinforcements are too far off, the older man pushes for more professional security, but when he suggests evacuating somewhere else, Allmark firmly shuts that down. Allmark explains that leaving would play right into the hands of the men he spotted watching the mansion, since they've probably already mapped out the area to trap them if they try to run. Turning to defense upgrades, Muzan suggests fixing the lack of garden lighting by pointing the lamps outward, making it a lot harder for anyone to sneak up on the mansion unseen. Nodding the outer walls are way too low for comfort, Allmark proposes putting up anti-climb spikes, explaining these sharpened wooden barriers are commonly used to protect fortresses or block off roads. After agreeing to use their firewood to build the defenses, Allmark asks that the threat stay a secret from Wendy for now, wanting her to enjoy their visit without fear before they all head in for dinner. As the group relaxes on the sofa, Wendy talks up how excited she is for tomorrow's meal, while the boys get treated to a spread of impressive snacks that catch their eye. The boys share a rare moment of genuine laughter, swapping personal stories, both quietly wishing this peaceful, happy atmosphere could just last forever. The story shifts to a darker perspective, a mercenary who sees lives purely as income, splitting people into those worth money and those who aren't, women and children included. Gizzard, known as the Silver Skull, led the bloodshed mercenary corps by always siding with the winning team, keeping his small crew alive despite their obvious weaknesses. Gizzard's long run of good calls ended 6 months back when a massive mercenary group collapsed and nearly took his own corps down with it during a brutal enemy attack. With their reputation shot up north, Gizzard was about to turn to banditry until a surprisingly lucrative offer came in to stir up trouble for a rival noble down in the Kingdom of Galai. Scouting the target, the mercenaries figure the mansion's security is weak enough to hit right away, but they still follow their employer's oddly cautious order to wait until the guards' vigilance fades. Things shift fast when the mercenaries hear that 2 strange kids have entered the mansion, turning the whole relaxed vibe of the estate on its head. Watching the new defenses go up, Gizzard realizes they've already blown their window for an easy job, now facing a real siege, and he's furious the kids showing up complicated everything. Despite orders to hold off, Gizzard decides they've got to hit tonight, worried any more delay means the guards catch on and they end up captured or dead. Gizzard orders his second, Derek, to round up the whole crew, deciding to strike now while only 2 kids are around before any backup can show up. While Derek assumes the payout's going to fund their return to mercenary life up north, Gizzard makes it clear he's got zero intention of going back to that hell. Gizzard reveals his real specialty is turning employers into a permanent paycheck, planning to extort them for monthly payments by threatening to expose them as the masterminds behind the whole thing. 2 men stand at the edge of the forest eyeing the distant mansion, no regrets about the harsh life they've left behind, just focused on surviving in this new land. Surveying the blood-stained interior of the estate, the leader waves off the residents' defensive spikes and amateur resistance as a total waste of his time. Standing over a fallen man in a suit, the leader coldly notes his own men need retraining, way too sloppy. Under cover of night, the armed invaders launch their coordinated raid, charging straight for the mansion's high stone walls. They scale the perimeter by boosting each other up, quickly reaching the top to secure a foothold inside the grounds. Once they're up top, they're surprised to spot sharpened barricades waiting below and start scanning for a safe way down. They find a gap in the spikes to get through, nodding the mansion's defenses would have only gotten worse if they'd waited until the next day. The leader reflects on his call to strike tonight, outmaneuvering the enemy's advisor, just as the mansion guards catch onto their presence. Gearing up for close combat, the big guy in the group pulls a pair of heavy axes off the harness on his back. Trying to push in through the rear, the intruders run into guards holding spears, a move the leader admits is a smart way for amateurs to keep their distance. Reading their hesitant stances, the leader figures these guards just don't have it in them to actually kill someone. Just the swordsman showing up and drawing his blade is enough to send the guards into full panic. He mocks them, saying their lives aren't even worth a single copper coin to take. With one swift, brutal strike, he cuts off a guard's arm and tells the rest to crawl into the shadows and shake if they're too scared to fight. Walking past the fallen defenders, he repeats that he's got no interest in pointless slaughter, warning the last guard standing to stay out of his way. The 2 men confirm their main target, the girl, is up on the 3rd floor since she was spotted earlier looking out over the courtyard. Elsewhere in the building, the big guy easily shatters a guard's spear before crushing his helmet with a follow-up blow. He keeps smashing through the mansion's interior while the leader tells him to stay disciplined and not make any fatal slip-ups. They find a woman killed by 2 clean strikes to the back, which the leader recognizes as Darren's signature move, though he notes the fight took longer than expected. Moving through the corpse-filled hallway, the men grow irritated with the delay, worried the girl might slip away while they they deal with the last of the resistance. Two men walk through the halls griping about the elite Crimson mercenaries wasting time on worthless kills instead of the target, worried about the state of things and what's waiting on the third floor. They stop at a body on the floor and realize a man named Void's been taken out with a single strike. The discovery shakes them, wondering who in this mansion could possibly drop someone of his caliber without any warning at all. One of them's fuming that a job that should have been as easy as putting a baby to sleep has turned into a mess, despite the guards going down without a fight. They corner a young kid who immediately corrects them. He's not just some kid. The kid calls himself a warrior, and one of the men realizes he's seen those cold eyes before, right as an attacker lunges at him for looking distracted. The kid ends it with a single slash, and the guy watching realizes that counterattack wasn't luck, it was pure precision. Breaking down the strike, it's clear the kid used barely any movement to dodge and counter at once, prompting the man to ask if he's from the north. Asked if he was hired as a mercenary by the household, the kid just says he's a friend of the girl who lives there. The man refuses to believe a noble girl and a northern mercenary could actually be friends, and demands to know the kid's real name. The mention of the Black Wolf Cavalry and Shadow Fang makes the man's face shift to pure shock. He finally puts it together: this is Allmark, son of a man named Reyes. That realization sparks pure hatred, since the mercenary recognizes him as part of the group that wiped out their Fire Dragon vanguard. A big mercenary with an axe steps up, demanding Allmark name every fighter he's beaten before, and Allmark mentions a warrior named Ninang. Allmark keeps going, naming top-class fighters like Irwin and Angal, which makes the big guy claim Allmark as his personal target. The man introduces himself as Blood Axe Darren, ace of the Crimson mercenaries, vowing to be Allmark's final opponent. Darren admits the kid's strong for his age, as the two of them get ready to clash in the hallway. The fight breaks out, Darren swinging his heavy axe while Allmark uses quick footwork and his blade to parry the massive hits. Darren keeps up the aggressive assault, powerful swings forcing Allmark onto the defensive. Despite the overwhelming force behind every axe strike, Allmark stays composed, deflecting the heavy blows one after another. The duel keeps escalating, the big guy unleashing heavy swings that Allmark barely manages to parry with his sword. Watching the fight, another man notes that while Darren had control at first, Allmark's counterattacks are starting to turn things around. Deciding they can't afford to wait any longer, two of the men rush toward the inner room to finish the job. They burst into the chamber, ignoring the sounds of battle behind them, closing in on their target. Hidden behind the curtains, a young girl waits in silence as the intruders search the room. The man finds her hiding spot and lets out a sinister sigh of satisfaction, having waited for exactly this moment to strike. Standing over her, he declares that once she's dead, their whole mission's finally complete. In one brutal swing, he cuts her down right where she sits. Holding the severed head by its hair, the man feels relief that he doesn't have to deal with the brat anymore and signals his men to pull back. His escape gets cut short when Allmark shouts for Muzin outside, and a stout kid with a staff comes charging through the doorway. The man's stunned to find himself facing an actual mage as a massive burst of magical energy erupts from the kid's staff. Blown clean out through the window by the force of it, the man's left wondering just who these kids actually are. Back in the hallway, Allmark seizes the opening to land a lethal blow on the man with the eye patch. Furious over his fallen comrade, Darren roars at Allmark to move as he lines up a desperate attack. The two of them trade a frantic flurry of blows, Allmark's sword clashing against Darren's twin axes in a pure test of speed. Mid-struggle, Allmark's eyes flick toward the gruesome scene unfolding inside the room. He sees the head of the girl he thinks is Wendy and lets out a pained groan at the horrible sight, apologizing for letting things go this far. Shoving his emotions down, he shouts for Muzin to strike again, catching the last enemy off guard. Muzin lets loose another powerful swing of his staff, ripping a massive wave of force through the room. Praising Muzin's timing, Allmark uses the distraction to launch one final, heavy assault on the big guy. The duel spills into the room as one last struggle breaks out behind the heavy curtains. The man can't keep up as Allmark's strikes come faster and harder with every clash, even with two blades to defend himself. Fearing hell gets swallowed whole, the man swings desperately, only to get cut down as a heavy strike tears clean through his chest. Darren stands frozen in shock at his own defeat, while Allmark names himself Warrior Allmark and watches the mercenary drop his axes. Mortally wounded, the blade straight straight through his torso, the mercenary accepts his fate as it finally sinks in. In his final moments, he reflects on his simple wish to go out with the dignity of a real warrior. To him, dying on the battlefield beats fatting away quietly under some soft southern breeze any day. Coughing up blood, he finds a strange comfort in the fact that his mercenary life ended crossing blades with a true warrior, one who might grow from this fight. With a final nod to the young warrior, the man's head slumps forward, offering up one last parting gift. The mercenary staggers back before his body finally gives out and he collapses to the floor. From the shadows of the nearby brush, the leader watches the whole scene, realizing all his men, Darren included, are wiped out. He decides to retreat and regroup, but his escape gets interrupted when he spots a strange fragment on the ground. Looking down, stunned, he finds a broken vase, wondering how it could have ended up there. Allmark appears right behind him, announcing he's the last one left, leaving the man completely baffled how any of this is happening. Holding the broken pottery, the man demands to know what's going on, while Allmark vows to protect the girl from bastards exactly like him. Furious, the leader curses Allmark's family, warning him to watch out for the Black Wolf, still lurking somewhere out there as a hidden fang. He reveals the connection to Allmark's father, Reyes, who commanded a separate unit as a powerful deputy commander. Accepting the missions failed with no moves left, the man asks if the young mage plans to let him walk away. Allmark refuses to let him escape, saying he has to erase the girl's fear completely if she's ever going to feel safe again. The leader gets ready to fight his way out but freezes in shock when Allmark addresses him by his real name, Silver Skull Gizzart, despite never introducing himself. Allmark remembers his father's old bedtime stories about the brutal history of the Crimson Mercenary Corps, but notes that even with that reputation, the man was still respected as a first-class soldier. Facing the veteran in person, Allmark declares he'll take down Mercenary Gizzart with respect, and the mercenary actually finds the challenge kind of amusing. Gizzart tells him to burn the ultimate technique, the Silver Skull of the North, into his memory before he dies, as they get ready to clash in the ruins. Watching how his opponent moves, Gizzart realizes a drawn-out fight won't work in his favor and looks to end things in one decisive move, though Allmark won't let him close the gap. With all his men dead, the veteran admits it's basically impossible to handle Allmark while a mage is backing him up. Deciding he's got to switch things up, Gizzart gets ready to charge in and force an opening in Allmark's defense. Gizzart dodges a swing he calls too naive, realizing Allmark's deliberately creating distance, exactly the position the mercenary wanted him in. As Gizzart closes into his optimal range, Allmark stays unfazed, still convinced he's the one winning this whole game of tactics. A sudden clash catches the veteran off guard by Allmark's precision and the ice-cold focus in his eyes. Their blades lock in a heavy struggle, and Allmark stares his opponent down without a hint of hesitation. Gizzart notices that, unlike every other warrior he's fought, this kid isn't intimidated at all, no anger, no fear, nothing showing in his eyes. The veteran fires back with a series of aggressive strikes, warning Allmark not to get cocky in the middle of the exchange. A powerful blow lands against Allmark's guard, forcing him to absorb the full weight of the mercenary's battle-tested swordsmanship. Bleeding from the mouth, Allmark calmly notes that just staying alive here is a struggle, while Gizzart gets irritated the brat hasn't even stumbled yet. Charging in again, the veteran tells him to let his instincts take over and remember the true feel of the battlefield. Reading the wind, thinking he's found the perfect opening, Gizzart lunges for the finishing blow, sure he's finally caught his target. The mercenary screams in frustration when Allmark takes the hit anyway and reveals he'd already figured out the veteran's patterns way earlier. Exploiting the shock, Allmark uses blindingly fast footwork to close the distance before Gizzart can reset his stance. A heavy slash tears through the veteran's chest as he realizes Allmark's attacks have gotten too heavy for him to block. Coughing up blood, Gizzart finally understands that Sharp Gaze was a student soaking up a lesson, and to Allmark he was never more than a target to learn from. Allmark tells the mercenary Gizzart he'll take him down with respect, then delivers the lethal strike that makes Gizzart realize he was just a tool for the kid's growth all along. A voice acknowledges Allmark as a genius swordsman, telling him to keep moving forward. With one last smirk, Gizzart warns that Allmark's path will always be soaked in blood before his body finally hits the ground. The mercenary lies dead in a pool of his own blood. Allmark stands there trembling trembling, panting, feeling the full weight of a victory that came way too close. Looking down at his shaking hands, he admits to himself the mercenary genuinely had more skill and experience than he did. He figures the only reason he won is because the man rushed his finishing blow out of fear, and as Muzan runs up, Allmark reflects on how unpredictable battles like this really are. Muzan hands Allmark his scabbard back and reports that Wendy's being watched over by Ward and the others on the 4th floor. When Ward and the group arrive, Allmark's told Wendy still hasn't woken up, worn out from everything she went through alone. Back during the crisis, Allmark had warned Wendy to stay away from the window, since her father's enemies were coming specifically to kill her. Refusing to just be a victim, Wendy had declared with fierce resolve that she wasn't going to let anyone else die. Allmark had watched in shock as an overwhelming wave of magical power started radiating off her. Sensing power way beyond ordinary magic, Allmark tells a panicked Muzan to grab his staff so they can follow Wendy as the mercenaries close in. As the group tries to evacuate, Wendy suddenly appears with her staff, ordering everyone up to the 4th floor since intruders have breached the grounds. The butler watches in disbelief as a decorative vase begins warping and shifting right there on its pedestal. He recognizes it as advanced transmutation magic, and Wendy insists on staying behind to create decoys while the rest of the staff makes their escape. The butler argues that fake servants won't actually stop the threat, but Allmark cuts in and tells him to trust Wendy's strategy. Allmark urges Wendy to create as many decoys as possible, starting with a replacement for herself since she's the primary target. Under all that pressure, Allmark reminds her that everyone's life is riding on this, and Wendy starts duplicating herself. Wendy successfully transforms the furniture into a set of magical servants, getting ready to face down the coming intruders. Muzan's shocked that even high schoolers couldn't pull off magic like this, noting Wendy could barely do small tricks before break started. Someone else points out Wendy's struggling to control this power and needs to squeeze everything she can out of her transmutation magic right now, since even Ilmi's sensei might not manage something like this. Allmark whispers a secret plan to Muzan, who reacts in total shock, insisting it's impossible, but Allmark keeps pushing until Muzan finally gives in. Wendy tries to create guards but struggles to remember their faces exactly, realizing that recreating people the enemies already killed would just tip them off. Even so, she manages 20 servants, feeling the pressure to hurry while everyone else notices just how hard this feat really is. Wendy suddenly collapses from the strain, pleading with Allmark and Muzan to protect the mansion and telling everyone else to run. Allmark catches her as she goes unconscious, leaving the group and Ward in total distress. Allmark vows to protect Wendy no matter what, telling Ward to evacuate the staff to the 4th floor while he stays back to hold off the invaders using her replicated decoys. When the older man hesitates, Allmark and Muzan insist that as magicians, it's their job now to protect the real Wendy, and there's no time left before the enemy arrives. Ward acknowledges Allmark's read on the situation and promises to repay the favor before ordering the staff to carry Wendy up to the 4th floor. As they retreat, the sound of the enemy closing in echoes down the hallway, and Muzan braces for what's coming. Allmark tells the group that Wendy's magic will keep the decoys intact even if they get killed in battle as long as the mana holds. Then he tells Muzan to get into position as everyone else moves out. Muzan admits he's terrified about Allmark facing the enemy alone at the door, but Allmark just asks him to trust him, promising he'll be fine. Muzan doubts he can even pull off the wind and transformation magic they learned at the academy, but Allmark tells him to trust their training as they take their final positions. Standing outside Wendy's room, Allmark points out a blind spot behind the door perfect for an ambush, and confirms to a worried Muzan that he's genuinely ready to fight. Allmark admits he's terrified to the point of nearly collapsing, since they're up against battle-hardened mercenaries with no guarantee they'll survive. He explains that fear is exactly what's kept him alive this long, and tells Muzan to focus purely on staying alive before they split up to face the screams and chaos coming from below. Downstairs, the mercenaries launch their brutal assault, cutting through the defenders with brutal efficiency as the mansion turns into a scene of pure carnage. Hearing the sounds of slaughter, Allmark thinks back on his past up north and the irony of having to pick up a longsword again in a peaceful southern town. He recognizes the heavy footsteps and movements of the attackers instantly, professional mercenaries from the north, no doubt. Allmark watches the mercenaries relish the smell of iron and blood, noticing noticing their hunger for combat, and admits he feels that same primal pull himself. Despite his blood boiling, Allmark's mind stays cold and focused as he readies his sword to fulfill his vow to protect Wendy. With every last bit of hesitation gone, he feels a cold northern wind settle in his heart and prepares to meet the intruders. The mercenaries reach the target floor, griping about how easy the servants were to cut down, and head toward the back room where they think their target's hiding, while Allmark waits for them in the shadows. Allmark delivers a decisive strike against his opponent as the brutal duel reaches its bloody conclusion. Chased by two mercenaries, he finds an opening and drops one of them, drawing the rest of the enemies straight into the fray. Seeing the mercenary captain finally step toward him, Allmark feels certain his plan's working and decides to put all his trust in his own sword. He thinks back on Wendy's magic and Muzin's courage, realizing her transformation spell was the only reason any of them made it through. Walking alongside Muzin, he admits he could only really handle 3 opponents at once, and taking out half the group early on is what actually turned the fight in their favor. Allmark gives Wendy all the credit for their success, while Muzin and Ward look on in silence before Ward turns his attention to the young warrior. Looking him dead in the eye, Ward asks if he's really a northern mercenary. Confirming his past, Allmark admits he's the son of a mercenary but insists those days are behind him now, while Ward watches the servants carry away the fallen. Muzin tells him he overheard the whole conversation about his father while waiting in the other room. Ward explains he'd had suspicions from the start since Allmark carries a completely different aura than the other students, and his calm demeanor tonight just confirmed it. He mentions how northern mercenaries have a reputation as ruthless people who weigh human lives in gold, and the attackers at the mansion were exactly that kind. The grim aftermath shows 13 guards lost their lives and 4 more got seriously hurt, while a few fled their posts to save themselves. Ward mourns the loss of innocent lives, blaming his own lack of power and foresight for the tragedy. Allmark tells him not to carry that guilt since the guards fulfilled their duty with honor, the same way mercenaries always stay ready for the end. Watching the bodies get carried off, he wonders if any of the guards ever expected to die today, wrestling with the fact that he's already cut down so many people himself. Ward admits his own terror, watching just 8 mercenaries wipe out 20 guards without taking a single hit. He confesses seeing Allmark take down those beasts single-handedly is just as frightening to him in its own way. Stunned at being called terrifying, Allmark tries to square his violent side with memories of happier times and the smiles of his friends. Breaking the heavy silence, Muzin steps forward with total conviction, declaring he believes in his friend. With tears in his eyes, Muzin shouts at the top of his lungs that he believes in Allmark no matter what. Muzin shouts that it doesn't matter if Allmark's a mercenary or a mercenary's son, because Allmark was the one who believed in him first. Allmark quietly thanks him as Muzin clutches his chest, struggling to hold back the flood of emotion. Muzin thinks back on how scared he used to be of Allmark's cold demeanor, wondering how someone his age could be a northern soldier without ever showing fear. He remembers learning Allmark was the son of Rays from the Black Wolf Cavalry, and realizes Allmark never actually denied being part of a mercenary group. Despite the bloody reputation northern mercenaries carry, Muzin decides Allmark's strength is a secret he can finally trust in a moment like this. He thinks back on why Allmark stayed so quiet about his past, remembering Wendy's final plea for them to protect the manor. Muzin decides protecting the house comes first. He can worry about apologizing to Allmark for doubting him later. Gripping his wooden staff with shaking hands, Muzin braces himself as the sounds of the approaching fight signal that time's run out. His anxiety spikes as he struggles to control his magic, feeling a desperate urge to hide or just run from the threat closing in. When a smiling man appears and targets the girl, Muzin realizes she's truly alone and knows he has to act right then and there. Just as he's about to move, a hand reaches out and touches his back, Allmark's voice calling out his name. Drawing courage from Allmark's belief in him, Muzin swings his staff and stands his ground against the enemy. He shouts that he'll believe in Allmark no matter what anyone else says, because Allmark's words were the ones that gave him strength. After it's all over, Ward approaches Allmark and Muzin to explain his earlier comments were just his personal feelings talking. He clarifies that as a butler of the Burherb family, his personal opinions about mercenaries don't factor into his official duties. Ward looks at the injured Allmark and says the kid risking his life to protect Wendy is more than enough to earn his full trust. The butler then bows deep under the moonlight, offering his sincere thanks to both boys. He passes along his gratitude on behalf of Lord Ermund, while Muzin looks on, stunned to see Allmark crying for the first time. Allmark wipes his tears in confusion while Ward apologizes for his roundabout way of talking, acknowledging the kid's strength. Both boys get flustered by the butler's formal display of respect, urging Ward to stand up and get back to his remaining duties. Ward's about to handle the rest of the cleanup when Allmark stops him with a request to keep the truth about the mercenaries' deaths quiet. He suggests crediting the guards instead so their families get better compensation, and insists Wendy and her family stay in the dark about what really happened. Reflecting on his actions, Allmark notes that while Wendy exhausted herself just to avoid taking a single life, he's already killed 8 people, and he can't help wondering if she could ever accept who he really is. He'd thought at first she might understand, but the weight of it all makes him worry. Shed look at him with fear, like he's nothing but a monster. Ward agrees to keep it confidential, even from the other servants, and accepts Allmark's thanks before suddenly asking if he feels any shame about his mercenary origins. Ward clarifies his earlier reaction actually came from awe at Allmark's northern strength, not contempt, nodding that people in the south usually just don't understand mercenaries because of bad past encounters. Allmark apologizes for the misunderstanding and states firmly he'd never deny his father or his heritage, though he admits his only real fear is losing Wendy's trust. Ward reassures him her bond with him runs deep. He points out she's kind enough that Shed probably feel the same even knowing about his past as a killer, especially since she once swore Shed never let anyone die again. Despite the reassurance, Allmark confesses his real fear of being rejected, and Ward finally agrees to drop it and walks off, leaving the boy hopping for a chance to repay the favor someday. Muzin walks up and offers a silent gesture of support, promising to stay quiet about everything if that's what Allmark wants. Grateful, Allmark thanks Muzin, and the two of them head back toward the manor together.